The rain had been falling for 3 hours when Kwon Ji-taek looked at Naomi Everette and said the words that would cost him everything. She had just pulled a bullet fragment from somewhere near his liver using a pair of hemostatic forceps and a flashlight held between her teeth. Her hands were steady. Her coat was soaked through. Her knees were bleeding from the dock, grating where she'd knelt in the dark for 40 minutes keeping a stranger alive who had no business surviving the night. He looked up at her from the crate she'd propped him against, and the first thing out of his mouth was not thank you. "I would never touch a woman like you," he said, "so don't get any ideas." His men were standing 10 feet away, and every single one of them heard it. Naomi didn't cry. She didn't argue. She packed her medical bag with the same methodical precision she'd used to save his life, stood up, and left a note folded under his hand. "You owe me a life." She walked off those docks and never looked back. But she was already carrying something of his that she hadn't yet found the words to name. If you've ever done everything right for someone and still been treated like you were nothing, stay with this story. Because what happens next is going to remind you exactly why dignity is the one thing no one can take unless you hand it over. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Hit that like button. And drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning of the night that changed everything. Naomi Everette was not supposed to be at the Greyhaven docks that Tuesday. She'd gotten a call around 9:15 from a clinic volunteer who said a dock worker had a hand laceration that wouldn't stop bleeding, and the man was too stubborn to go to the ER. That was the whole reason she packed her bag, borrowed her neighbor's car, and drove 22 minutes in the rain to a part of Greyhaven that smelled like diesel and salt water and something she couldn't identify but didn't like. The dock worker was fine. 6 stitches, a bandage, a lecture about tetanus, and he was back to arguing with his foreman inside of 30 minutes. Naomi was walking back to the car when the shooting started. She didn't run toward it. That would be the story people would later tell, that she ran toward gunfire like she was fearless, like she was built for that kind of moment. The truth was messier. She stopped walking. She stood behind a shipping container, with her bag pressed against her chest and her heart doing something erratic and unpleasant inside her ribs, and she listened. 3 shots. A pause, 2 more, a sound she recognized as a man going down hard on metal grating. Then silence except for the rain. She told herself to go back to the car. She went toward the sound instead, because that is what 12 years of emergency nursing does to you. It rewires the part of your brain that's supposed to know to when run. You don't stop being afraid. You just stop letting the fear make decisions. There were 4 men on the ground, near container row C. 3 of them, she could tell immediately, were beyond anything she carried in that bag. The 4th was still moving barely, with the shallow, working hard quality of breath that told her his body was fighting hard for something it might not be able to hold. She got to him and her flashlight found his face. She didn't know who he was. Not then. She saw a man in an expensive suit that was ruined beyond recovery, dark hair plastered flat by the rain, jaw set so tight she could see the muscle working even through the pain. He was pressing both hands against his left side, and the blood was coming through his fingers in a way that told her she had maybe 10 minutes, if she was lucky, and 6 if she wasn't. "I'm a nurse," she said. "I'm going to help you. Don't fight me." He looked at her with eyes that were sharp, even through the shock, the kind of sharp that doesn't go away, even when the body is failing. "Who are you?" "Someone who is currently your only option," Naomi said, and opened her bag. She worked fast. Not panicked fast, precise fast. The kind that comes from having done this in conditions that would make most people's hands shake. She'd worked field triage in 2 countries before she ever set foot in Washington state. She'd kept people alive on a dirt floor with a flashlight and a prayer and equipment that belonged in a museum. A shipping dock in the rain was not ideal, but it was not her worst. The bullet had gone in at an angle. There was a fragment she could feel but not see. Getting it out without the right tools, without proper lighting, without an oar and a team, was going to be the kind of thing she would replay in her sleep for weeks. She got it out. It took 38 minutes, and she talked the whole time, not to comfort him, but to keep him conscious, Because if he went under, she wasn't sure she could bring him back without more than she had. She talked about nothing. She talked about the rain. About the coffee she hadn't finished before she left her apartment. About a patient she'd had years ago who'd argued with her. About the proper technique for wrapping sprain right up until the moment he passed out from blood loss. He didn't talk back much, but he stayed awake. 3 other men materialized out of the dark about 15 minutes in large men, quiet in the way that meant professional, spreading out around her, and the man on the ground without a word. She registered them. She didn't stop working. One of them said something in Korean that she didn't catch, and the man beneath her hand said something back that was clearly a command, because all 3 of them took 2 steps back and went still. "They won't touch you," he said to her, in English now. His voice had more texture than she expected, for someone losing the amount of blood he was losing. "Finish. I wasn't planning to stop," Naomi said. She closed him up with what she had. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't what she would have done in an OR with the right materials and 3 more pairs of hands. But it was enough. That was the thing about field medicine. That people who'd never done it didn't understand enough was the whole victory. You weren't trying for perfect. You were trying for alive. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and let herself breathe for the first time in almost an hour. The man looked at her. His color was still bad. He needed a proper transfusion, monitoring, real care. He knew it. She could see him calculating it. "You're going to need a hospital," she said. "I can stabilize you further, but I can't replace what you've lost here. You need a blood transfusion within the next few hours. Not a hospital flat, no negotiation in it. Then a doctor. A real facility. Something I can reach by phone to come to you. That will be arranged." He looked at her steadily. "You saved my life, yes. You did not run, no." Something shifted in his face. Not gratitude, not yet. Something more like recalibration. The look of a man who has just encountered something that doesn't fit his existing model of the world and is deciding where to file it. She would think about that expression later, lying awake in her apartment, and wonder if she'd misread it. She hadn't. Then one of his men leaned down and said something to him, in Korean quiet, and the man's eyes came back to her face with a different quality. Cooler, more contained. "Who sent you?" he asked. Naomi blinked. "No one sent me, I told you. I'm a nurse. I was here for an unrelated call. You arrived immediately after my ambush. You knew exactly where I was positioned." She stared at him. "I heard the shots. I followed the sound of someone still breathing." She held up her hands, still gloved, still carrying the evidence of the last 40 minutes all over her. "I'm a nurse. This is what I do." Convenient. The word landed with a specific weight. Not confused. Decided. She felt the shift before she fully understood it, the men repositioning around her, the man's expression closing off, the calculation behind his eyes turning from recalibration to something colder. He was deciding she was a threat. He was deciding the woman who had just spent 40 minutes bleeding her knees raw on his behalf was part of some elaborate trap. It would have been almost funny if she'd had the distance for it. "Check her bag," he said to one of his men. They went through everything. Every supply, every instrument, everything she carried with her. They did it with a thoroughness that told her these were not men who did anything halfway. She sat still and let them, because the alternative was to argue with 3 armed men who had just watched their boss nearly die, and Naomi Everette was not stupid. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. The man watched his men report back to him. He said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at her again, and she saw the decision had already been made, not that she was innocent, but that she was beneath further investigation. "My organization will compensate you," he said, "for your time." It was the word compensate that did something to the air between them. Clinical, transaction final. Like she was a contractor who'd performed a service, not a person who had just kept him breathing through 40 minutes of pain and fear and rain. She stood up. Her knees were protesting. She pulled off her gloves and looked at him. "I don't want compensation." His eyes moved over her, the kind of look that is not attraction but categorization. "Then what do you want?" "Nothing," Naomi said. "I want nothing from you." She paused. "I'm going to tell you what you need your people to do for you, medically, in the next 6 hours. I'd suggest you write it down. She gave instructions to the nearest man, step by step, clear as she could make it. Fluids, monitoring, signs of infection to watch for. Fever threshold that should trigger getting him into a surgical facility, regardless of how much he didn't want to go. The man was recording it on his phone. Then she picked up her bag. That was when it happened. One of his men, younger than the others, with the kind of face that wanted to impress its boss, said something in Korean that made the other two stiffen slightly. Whatever it was, it carried the kind of inflection that didn't need translation. The angle of the younger man's eyes as he looked at Naomi said enough. The man on the ground didn't stop it. He let it sit there for a moment, the comment, the laughter that followed from one of the others, and then he looked at Naomi with that closed, cool expression and said, "Don't misunderstand tonight. I would never be with a woman like you. Whatever you imagined you were doing here, forget it." The words were so deliberate and so unnecessary that for a moment she thought she'd misheard him. He was still pale. He was still leaking through the patch job she'd done. He could still die tonight if his people didn't follow her instructions to the letter. And he had chosen this moment to make sure she understood her place. His men were watching her, waiting. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that the silence got uncomfortable, long enough that she saw something flicker behind his eyes, something she couldn't name and didn't try to. Then she reached into her coat pocket, found the notepad she always carried, wrote 4 words, tore the sheet off, folded it, and placed it under his hand. She walked away. She walked all the way back to the borrowed car, got in, and sat in the dark for maybe 2 minutes with her hands in her lap. Then she started the engine and drove home. She did not cry until she got to her apartment. And even then, it was more anger than grief, the specific corrosive kind of anger that comes from being reduced to nothing by someone you just chose to see as a human being worth saving. She was in the bathroom, washing the blood off her hands, when the nausea hit. She stood over the sink and breathed through it, and told herself it was the adrenaline crash. The body's way of processing the kind of night she'd just had. That was all it was. She was tired, she was angry. She'd been in the rain, for hours doing something that would have broken most people, and her body was just recalibrating. She believed that for about 6 more days. On day 7, she bought a test from the pharmacy 2 neighborhoods over, because she did not want to run into anyone she knew. She took it home and set it on the bathroom counter and stood outside the door for 4 minutes before she went back in. She stood in the bathroom for a long time after that. She thought about the rain. She thought about the docks. She thought about a man who had looked at her with something that might have been wonder for exactly 1 moment before he decided she was nothing. She thought about 4 words on a folded piece of paper. "You owe me a life." She pressed her palm flat against the bathroom wall and thought, Okay, figure out what comes next. What came next was a decision, and it took her 3 days to make it. She was not impulsive. That was the thing people who didn't know her always got wrong. They saw a black woman who worked field triage and went toward gunfire and assumed some kind of recklessness. Naomi Everette decisions the way she worked on patients, methodically, with full accounting of what she had and what she didn't, and without sentiment clouding the assessment. She had no illusions about what going back would look like. She'd spent 7 days quietly learning who Kwon Ji-taek was, pulling from the kind of sources that are public if you know how to read them. She understood the shape of his world with enough clarity to know that walking back into it would be the kind of thing you couldn't undo. She made the other decision instead. She gave notice at the clinic. She packed what fit in her car. She drove south and then west and found a small coastal town in Oregon called Morro Bay, where the main industry was fishing, and the community clinic was run by a 71-year-old doctor named Patterson who needed help and didn't ask questions about why a skilled trauma nurse would choose this particular quiet corner of the world. She set up an apartment that was smaller than her last one and had a radiator that knocked and a view of the water that made up for most of it. She started building a life for 2. Before she left Greyhaven, she did one thing she couldn't entirely explain. She'd kept the ultrasound photograph, the first one, grainy and strange and evidence of something she was still metabolizing, and she wrote on the back of it, "Not to Ji-taek, not exactly to the child, somewhere in between." A promise measured and plain, this baby will be loved. That is the only thing that matters here. She left it somewhere. She knew his people would eventually find it, if they ever came looking. She didn't expect them to come looking. She was wrong about that. Back in Greyhaven, in a recovered and heavily guarded estate on the North Hill, Kwon Ji-taek was not having the kind of recovery his doctors had prescribed. He was working or something near enough to it that the distinction barely mattered. He was on calls. He was reviewing reports. He was conducting the particular kind of business that does not pause for bullet wounds. But there were hours-late ones, the kind his people had learned not to interrupt, when the reports would sit untouched and he would be still in a way that was unfamiliar. His head of security, a man named Yoon, who had been with him for 11 years, noted it and said nothing. Ji-taek was not a man who let things stay unresolved. That was perhaps the clearest thing Yoon understood about him, not his intelligence, not his ruthlessness, not his patience and strategy. Those were tools. The inability to let an unresolved thing sit was something older. Something that had been in him before the power and the title and the empire. The woman at the dock was unresolved. She had not taken money. She had not tried to leverage him. She had done what she came to do and left him nothing but 4 words. And the precise medical instructions that his own doctors later confirmed had been exactly correct. Instructions that, his head of medical security admitted privately to Yoon, had almost certainly been the margin between Ji-taek surviving the night and not. She had saved his life. He had responded by humiliating her in front of his men. He was not going to examine that with any real honesty. Not yet. He was still at the stage of telling himself the wariness had been justified, that anyone appearing immediately after an ambush on his position had to be assessed as a threat, that he couldn't afford sentiment in the field, that what he'd said was simply the necessary removal of any misunderstanding. He told himself that. The words didn't quite hold their shape. He had her name it hadn't taken long, Naomi Everette. Field nurse, formerly international humanitarian work, now attached to a community clinic in Greyhaven. Decorated in the circles that decorated people who did what she did. No criminal record, no connection to any of the organizations that might have arranged the ambush on him that night. Nothing but a woman who had heard someone dying in the rain and made the decision to stop. He sat with that for longer than he was comfortable admitting. 3 weeks after the docks, a routine surveillance sweep of her known address came back empty. She had left her apartment. She had given notice at the clinic. She had, by every available record, simply gone. He told himself it was irrelevant. He reviewed the file again at 2 in the morning and closed it and opened it 2 more times before Yoon finally knocked on the door to ask if he needed anything. "Find out where she went," Ji-taek said. Yoon absorbed this without expression. Any particular reason or simply for completeness? Ji-taek looked at him. "I want to know she's all right." It was not the kind of thing he said. They both knew it. Yoon left without making anything of it, which was why he had lasted 11 years. The search would take time, and in the time it took, a report circulated through the humanitarian aid networks. Naomi Everette had once worked for a miscommunication between field databases, a clerical error that was genuinely not anyone's fault but sat in the system uncorrected that flagged her status as presumed deceased. The report reached Greyhaven's intelligence net on a Wednesday. Ji-taek read it at a standing desk at 6:45 in the morning, still holding his coffee, and felt something happen inside his chest that he did not have a name for. It was not grief. He barely knew the woman. It was something structural, the particular sensation of a thing having been permanently foreclosed. A door you hadn't even acknowledged wanting to walk through, nailed shut. He stood at that desk for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Find her." Not her records. Her and the search began in earnest. In Morro Bay, Oregon, Naomi Everette was 6 months into a pregnancy that was treating her with something approaching contempt. The first trimester had been rough. The second had evened out. The third was announcing itself with the kind of authority that made it clear her body was now running a separate agenda that she could participate in, but not direct. She was fine. She was tired, and sometimes frustrated, and occasionally overwhelmed at 2 in the morning when the radiator knocked and the weight of the decision she'd made felt heavier than usual. But she was fine. She had Patterson, who had stopped asking professional questions and started asking personal ones in the way that older doctors do when they've decided to adopt you. She had a neighbor named Dee who brought food without requiring gratitude for it. She had a clinic full of patients who needed someone good and were getting someone excellent. She had not thought about Kwon Ji-taek in at least 11 days. That was what she told herself on the morning. The black SUV with Washington plates appeared at the end of her street. She was standing at her kitchen window with her coffee, watching the water, and she saw it park. She saw the men who got out. She recognized the quality of stillness in the way they moved, professional stillness, the kind that knows exactly where everyone in a space is at all times. She put her coffee down. She sat down at the kitchen table and pressed both hands flat against the wood and breathed. She was 6 months pregnant in a small Oregon town, and Kwon Ji-taek's people had just found her. The knock at her door came 90 seconds later, measured, not aggressive. The knock of someone who already knows you're home. She crossed the kitchen. She opened the door. The man standing there was not Ji-taek. He was one of the men she'd seen at the dock older, with a steadiness about him that suggested rank. "Ms. Everette," he said, in careful English. "Mr. Kwon would like to speak with you." Naomi looked at him, then past him at the SUV, then back. "Mr. Kwon," she said, "can call me himself." The man absorbed this without changing expression. "He is here, Ms. Everette." The back door of the SUV opened, splitting, and Kwon Ji-taek stepped out into the gray Oregon morning, wearing a coat that cost more than 3 months of her rent, looking better than a man who'd survived what he'd survived had any right to look. He'd recovered well. Whatever medical resources he'd thrown at himself had been sufficient. He drew thinner than she remembered, and he moved with a slight guardedness around his left side that told her. The internal work wasn't quite finished, but he was standing upright, and he was looking directly at her, and he was walking toward her door. She stood in the doorway and did not step aside. He stopped at the base of her 2 porch steps. His eyes went to her stomach. She watched him process it, the fact of it, the timeline, the implication. She watched the calculation move through him. He was fast. She had noticed that on the dock, even in extremis. He was fast. The color left his face. "Who is the father?" he said. Not a question. The words of a man who already suspects the answer and is trying to find a version of events where he's wrong. Something inside Naomi went very still and very decided. "You have a lot of nerve," she said, showing up at my door. "Who is the father?" "You stood there," she said, "while your men laughed at me. She stopped, recalibrated. She was not going to do this on her porch. "Come inside or go back to wherever you came from," Ji-taek. "But make a decision, because I am not standing in this doorway in the cold." She went back inside. She heard him follow. She was at the kitchen counter when he came in, and she turned around. She looked at him in the plain morning light of her kitchen, not dock light, not crisis light, not the stripped-down clarity of emergency, and she felt the anger she'd been carrying for 6 months clarify into something sharp and specific. "The father," she said carefully, "is the man who told me he would never be with a woman like me." While his men watched, while he was still alive because of what I'd done, she held his gaze. "That man. Is that specific enough for you?" The silence in the kitchen was substantial. Ji-taek stood very still. He was not looking at her stomach anymore. He was looking at her face, with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not regret. Not yet. Maybe not ever the way she'd need it to look, but something that was cracks running through the certainty he'd walked in with. "I will bring you back to Greyhaven," he said finally. Naomi felt a sound want to come out of her that was almost a laugh. "Will you? You are carrying my child, my enemies." "Your enemies," she said, "are not my problem. I left your world. I built something else. That child is mine, and this life is mine. And you don't get to walk in here and start issuing instructions because you've decided I'm suddenly relevant." "Naomi, don't." The word was quiet, but it had mass. "Don't say my name like that. Like you know me." He stopped. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down. Because she was 6 months pregnant, and she was not going to stand for this entire conversation just to prove something. Say what you actually came here to say, she said. And then we'll figure out what happens next. He stood there in her kitchen, Kwon Ji-taek, feared head of the Haryong syndicate, and for one unguarded moment he looked like a man who had made a calculation he could not reverse, and was only now beginning to understand the full cost of it. He had no idea yet how much more it was going to cost him. Neither did she. He didn't sit down. That was the first thing Naomi noticed, that Kwon Ji-taek, standing in her kitchen with all the authority of a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence, did not sit down. He stood near the doorway like he hadn't decided yet whether he was staying, which told her more about his actual state of mind than anything he'd said so far. She waited. You should have told me, he said. The words came out careful and controlled in that way that meant the feeling underneath them was neither. Told you what exactly? Naomi kept her voice even. That you were going to be a father? When was I supposed to do that, Ji-taek? When you were telling me what category of woman you'd never touch? Or when your men were laughing? Which part of that evening seemed like the right opening? He didn't answer immediately. She watched something move behind his eyes. Not shame, not yet, maybe a first pass at something adjacent to it. I was wrong, he said. 2 words. Flat and deliberate, the way a man delivers something he's had to build up to say. Yes, Naomi said, you were. I'm not here to relitigate it. Then why are you here? Because you're carrying my child in a coastal town with 1 clinic and no protection, and 3 of the men responsible for the ambush on the docks have not been found. He said it like a briefing. Clinical. She recognized the move, the pivot from emotional territory to operational, where he was more comfortable. I have enemies. Real ones. Not abstract. And right now, whether you want to be or not, you are connected to me. Naomi pressed her fingertips against the kitchen table. I left your world. You can't leave the fact that it exists. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the water was flat and gray, and the town was doing its quiet morning thing. Fishermen and early commuters, and Dee from next door walking her dog, and all of it felt very far from the conversation happening inside this kitchen. If I go back to Greyhaven, she said slowly, what does that look like? You stay at the estate. You have full access to private medical care. Your needs are provided for. My needs. She let that sit there. What about what I want? He looked at her with the honest uncertainty of a man who has spent so long in this world where what he wants and what happens are the same thing, that the distinction has gone soft on him. What do you want? I want to not be managed, she said. I want to be spoken to like a person who just saved your life and is now carrying your baby and has spent 6 months doing that alone in another state. She stopped, exhaled. I want you to understand that this child is not a situation to be handled. This is a person, and whatever you think this arrangement is going to look like, it's going to from that understanding, or it's not going to start at all. The kitchen was very quiet. Ji-taek looked at her. Not the categorizing look from the dock, something slower than that. Something that was working harder. I understand, he said. She didn't entirely believe him. But she believed he believed it, which was a different thing and possibly enough to work with. I need a day, she said, to pack and to talk to Dr. Patterson. He nodded once. And your men stay outside, she added. While I do that. They don't come in to this building. They don't follow me around the clinic. And they don't talk to my neighbors about anything. Another nod. This one with something near the edge of it that might have been respect, or at least the beginning of it. One more thing, Naomi said. She met his eyes directly. You don't get to do what you did on those docks. Not ever again. Not to me, not in front of your people, not in private. Once. That happened once, you understand me? The silence went long enough that it had weight. Yes, Ji-taek said. She nodded. Then go wait in your car. I have calls to make. He went. She sat at the kitchen table after the door closed and listened to the radiator knock and felt the baby move a slow, rolling motion that had become so familiar over the past month that she sometimes forgot it was extraordinary, and she thought about what she was about to do with the complete honesty she'd only permit herself when she was alone. She was scared, not of Ji-taek exactly. She was scared of what it meant to walk into his world with a child inside her, and nothing to hold on to but her own judgment. which had already led her to one dock in the rain with a man who'd responded to her saving his life by making sure she knew her place. She was scared of loving this baby so much already, so completely and irreversibly, that she would make compromises she shouldn't make to protect that love. She was scared of being wrong. She pressed her palm against her stomach and breathed. Then she got up and started making phone calls. Dr. Patterson took it the way he took most things, with a silence that meant he was absorbing more than he was showing, followed by a question that directly to the thing she'd been trying not to look at directly. "Is this what you want?" he asked. "Not what's practical. Not what's safe, what you actually want." "I want my baby to be safe," she said. "That's not what I asked." She exhaled. "I don't know yet, Patterson. I genuinely don't know." "All right," he said. "Come say goodbye before you go. That's all I ask." She packed light. It was something she'd gotten good at, the discipline of knowing what was essential and leaving the rest. She took her medical bag first, because that was reflex. Then clothes, documentation, the small collection of things that constituted her personal life. The ultrasound photographs. The notepad she'd been using to write things down in the middle of the night when her brain wouldn't turn off, not a journal exactly. More like a running argument with herself. She took the photograph off the refrigerator last. The first one, the grainy one. The ones she'd written on the back of before she left Greyhaven. She hadn't left this copy anywhere. She'd kept it. She looked at it now, at her own handwriting on the back. "This baby will be loved. That is the only thing that matters here." And then she slipped it into the front pocket of her bag, where she could reach it. She was ready in 3 hours. The drive to Greyhaven took most of the day. Naomi sat in the back of the SUV with Ji-taek, and they did not speak for the first hour, which suited her. He worked on his phone. She looked out the window at Oregon giving way to Washington, and thought about the shape of what she was walking into with the careful, systematic attention she gave to problems that didn't have obvious solutions. Ji-taek's estate was on the North Hill. She'd known that much already, but knowing it and seeing it were different things. It was large without being ostentatious, which told her something about the kind of man he was when vanity and practicality conflicted. Security was heavy, but not visible in the amateur way. She clocked 3 positions on the approach and suspected there were twice that many she hadn't caught. Her room was on the 2nd floor, facing the garden. It was large, well-appointed, and had a separate bathroom and a daybed near the window that she immediately recognized had been put there recently, possibly this week. Someone had thought about what a pregnant woman might need. She didn't know if that was Ji-taek or a member of his staff, but either way it meant someone had been thinking ahead, which she filed under things to pay attention to. The estate's doctor came to her within the hour, a small, precise Korean-American man named Dr. Lim, who had clearly been told to be thorough and efficient, and not to make assumptions about what she did or didn't know. He was good. She could tell that inside the first 5 minutes. She asked him 3 technical questions about her 3rd trimester care, and his answers were current and specific, and she relaxed fractionally in a way she hadn't expected. She slept that night better than she had in 2 months, which she refused to feel complicated about. Her body needed rest. The bed was good. The radiator did not knock. She woke before dawn with a clear, specific instinct that something was wrong. It was not dramatic. No sound that shouldn't be there. No obvious disruption. It was something subtler, the quality of wrongness that a trained medical eye develops over years of noticing what doesn't fit the expected picture. She lay still for a moment, cataloging it. Then she got up. She wasn't supposed to be in Ji-taek's wing of the house. Nobody had said that explicitly, but the geography of the estate made it clear which spaces were operational and which were personal, and she had a strong instinct about which category his private quarters fell into. She went anyway. She found him in his study, not working. A sound bee cheese. He was sitting in a chair near the window, with a glass of water he hadn't drunk, and his right hand flat on the desk in a position that told her his body was trying to manage something without advertising it. She stood in the doorway. He looked up. In the low light, without the performance of authority, without the controlled exterior, he wore like a second skin. He looked tired in a way that went past tonight. He looked like a man who had been tired for a while and had gotten very skilled at not showing it. You should be resting, he said. So should you, she said. What's wrong with your hand? The pause was almost imperceptible. Nothing. Ji-taek. I said nothing. She walked into the room because she was a nurse, and the things she was seeing were adding up in a way she didn't like. She pulled a chair close to his and sat down, asking Mark mission, and looked at him with the clinical directness that was her default mode when something needed to be assessed. How long have the headaches been happening? She asked. He went very still. I didn't say I had headaches. You're squinting against the lamp that isn't bright enough to warrant squinting. You've had that glass of water for at least an hour without drinking it, which suggests the act of swallowing is uncomfortable, possible throat tension from sustained neck pain. Your right hand has been pressed flat on that desk since I walked in because it's trembling and you don't want me to see it. How long? The stillness held for another moment. Then something in him made a decision. 6 weeks, he said, approximately. 6 weeks. She ran the timeline. He'd been recovered from the bullet wound for longer than that fully recovered by his doctor's assessments. This was something else. Have you told Lim? No. Why not? He looked at her with the expression of a man who operates in a world where showing weakness is a specific kind of invitation. He didn't need to say it. I'm not one of your enemies, Naomi said, or your subordinates. So you can give me a reason that isn't about power dynamics. Something crossed his face. Almost amusement. Gone fast. I wasn't certain it was real, he said. Thought it would pass. And it didn't. No. She looked at him, the pallor she'd noticed and attributed to lighting. The slight hollowness around the eyes, the careful way he'd been moving that she'd read as residual bullet-wound caution and was now reading differently. Have you been eating? Yes. Consistently? The same appetite as before? A pause. Less any unusual fatigue? Beyond what your schedule would explain. Another pause. Longer. Yes. She felt the cold clarity settle that always came when a diagnosis started assembling itself, not fear exactly, but the sharpening that happened when the stakes became real. I need to run some tests. Tomorrow, with Lim, with your full cooperation. I'm not asking. You're not asking, he repeated. Not a challenge. Something more like he was hearing the sentence and deciding where to put it. No. I'm informing you. Because whatever is happening to you, it's been happening for 6 weeks with no intervention. And that window matters. She stood up. Drink the water. Then go to sleep. I mean actually sleep. Not sit here and think. She left him there and went back to her room. She lay awake for the next 2 hours, not thinking about Ji-taek specifically, but about what a set of symptoms like that, presenting in a pattern like that, over a timeline like that, typically pointed to. The differential was not long. The top of the list was not benign. She told herself she would know more tomorrow. She was right about that. She would know more tomorrow. She would also wish for a specific stretch of that afternoon. The specific about her instincts on the night she'd walked into his study. Lim ran the tests with the thoroughness Ji-taek's cooperation made possible, and he cooperated fully, which told Naomi that whatever resistance he'd shown the night before had resolved itself into something that looked a lot like trust. That was information. She set it aside for later. The results came back in stages across the afternoon. Lim found her in the estate's small library at 4 o'clock with a look on his face that he'd worked to keep neutral and hadn't entirely succeeded. The blood panel, he said. Tell me. He did. Systematically, precisely, without hedging more than the science warranted. When he finished, the library was quiet enough that Naomi could hear the garden outside, wind moving through something with leaves. You ran the heavy metal screen, she asked. Yes. And he set the tablet on the table so she could see the numbers. She looked at them for a long time. Thallium, trace levels, cumulative, consistent with ongoing low-dose exposure over, she did the math, approximately 6 to 8 weeks. Long enough to produce exactly the symptoms Ji-taek had described. Headaches, tremor, fatigue, appetite suppression, cumulative enough that without intervention, it would progress to neurological damage, organ involvement, and eventually something you could not bring someone back from. Someone was poisoning Kwon Ji-taek, not dramatically, not quickly, slowly, carefully, in doses calibrated to look like stress and overwork and recovery complications, Doses calibrated by someone who knew what they were doing and had access to him regularly enough to administer it without detection. Someone on the inside. You haven't told him yet, she said. I came to you first, Lim said. I wasn't certain how to. I'll tell him, Naomi said. Go prepare the collation protocol. I want to start treatment tonight. Lim left. She sat in the library for 3 more minutes. She thought about the doc, about the 4 words she'd left under his hand, about the 6 months alone in Marrow Bay, about the particular, specific awfulness of the fact that she was again in the position of saving Kwon Ji-taek's life, not because she'd chosen to be here, for that reason, but because life had arranged itself this way, and she was not capable of looking at a person deteriorating and deciding it wasn't her problem. She was furious about it, quietly and completely. She was also going to walk down that hallway and tell him the truth, because that's who she was, and no amount of fury at the situation was going to change that. She found him in the main meeting room with Yoon and 2 other men she didn't have names for yet. She opened the door without knocking, which produced an immediate shift in the room guards moving, hands going places they shouldn't, and she said flatly, I need everyone out except him. Now nobody moved immediately. They looked at Ji-taek. Ji-taek looked at her face. Whatever he read there, it was enough. Out, he said. The room cleared. She closed the door. She pulled out a chair, turned it backward, and sat down across from him, with her arms across the back, because she needed something to press against. Someone in your organization is poisoning you, she said. Thallium. Small amounts, consistent exposure, started approximately 6 to 8 weeks ago. You're not having a delayed recovery reaction. You're being murdered. Slowly enough that it would eventually look like your body failing for other reasons. She watched the information land. She had expected anger. She had expected the controlled fury that she'd already seen flicker at the edges of his composure. She had expected calculation. What she hadn't expected was the 2 seconds where he looked briefly and against his will, like something had reached through all the architecture he'd built around himself and hit something underneath it. 2 seconds, gone fast. But she'd seen it. Who knew about the tests, he said. Lim me now you, keep it that way, I intend to. She met his eyes. I need to start treatment tonight. Chelation therapy. It's going to take time, and it's going to make you feel worse before it makes you feel better. And you need to let Lim and me manage this without your interference. All right, that was too easy, she said. I'm aware of what thallium poisoning progresses to, he said. His voice was level. I'm not going to argue with the person who just found it. She nodded. Do you have a list of people with consistent enough access? Everyone in this house has access to me. Think narrower. Who handles your food, your drinks? Who has a reason that goes beyond just wanting control? He was quiet. His jaw was tight. She could see him building the list in his head and assessing it with the precision of a man who has spent his entire career reading who around him could be trusted and had clearly, recently, gotten it wrong. I have people to look into that, he said. I know you do, she said. But this is information for your people, not mine. I'm telling you what's happening to your body. What you do with the rest of it is your business. She stood up. Lim's setting up in the medical room. I'll see you there in 40 minutes. She was at the door when he said her name, Naomi. She stopped, didn't turn around immediately, then did. He was looking at her with that expression she'd seen twice now, the one she didn't quite have a category for. The one that was something older and more honest than his public face. Why, he said. It was a specific question, not generic. Why are you doing this for me? Again, after everything. She looked at him for a moment. Because that baby needs a father who's alive, she said. And because I am not going to let someone else decide how this story ends. She paused. And because you almost figured something out last night in that study. When you told me the truth, I'd like to see where that goes before someone poisons you to death. She left before he could respond. In the corridor outside, she exhaled against the wall and felt the baby roll and thought, do not make this into something it isn't. Do not let the fact that he's suddenly looking at you like a person instead of a category mean more than it means right now. She was going to have a very hard time following her own advice on that one. She didn't know yet. Across the estate, in a suite of rooms on the east wing that overlooked the formal garden. She was sound Seorina. Han Seorin was on a call she was conducting in a near whisper with the window facing away from the security cameras. She knew the locations of, because she'd helped design the placement 3 years ago. "He's not showing the symptoms on schedule," she said. The voice on the other end of the call was not warm. "Then the dose needs adjusting." "The nurse is here," Seorin said. "The American. She's living in the estate." A pause. "That complicates things, yes." Seorin's voice was smooth and precise. She was a woman who had cultivated both qualities across a decade of being the most capable person in rooms that consistently underestimated her, and she had learned to weaponize calm. "It does complicate things. I'll manage it." "How?" "Because I know this house better than anyone in it," she said. "Including him." She ended the call. She stood at the window for a moment, looking at the garden, and thought about the specific way Ji-taek had looked at the woman during dinner. Last night a look Sekyokrin had catalogued and examined and felt settle into something cold in the center of her chest. She had been with Ji-taek for 7 years. Not in the way people assumed it had never been simple, never been exclusive, had existed in the complex register of two people who are necessary to each other in ways that don't reduce to a single category. She had managed his communications, shaped his strategy, held things together in the spaces where power needed someone with precision and no ego about where the credit went. She had never been looked at the way he looked at that woman. Not once. She turned from the window and sat down at her desk and opened her laptop and began the particular work of someone who is very smart and very dangerous and has just decided that the situation has changed enough to require a different approach. Naomi got through the first week of Ji-taek's treatment by running on routine and clinical focus and this particular discipline of not thinking too far ahead. The chelation was proceeding as expected. His headaches were worse before they improved. The tremor in his hand reduced. He was a difficult patient, not dramatically, not with outbursts, but with the quiet resistance of a man for whom vulnerability in any form is a trained reflex to override. And sitting still while his body processed, the antidote required more active stillness than he was comfortable with. She brought him things to work on. Not because she was managing him, she told herself, but because idle was genuinely worse for him than occupied. "You don't have to stay," he said on the third evening, when she'd pulled a chair into the medical room and was reviewing her own notes. "I know," she said. "Then why?" "Because Lim's shift ended an hour ago, and I want to monitor your response to the increased dose myself, and I find it easier to do paperwork here than in the library." She turned a page. "Don't make it more complicated than it is." He was quiet for a while. "You do that," he said eventually. "Do what?" "Make things simpler than they are. Or simpler than I'm making them." She looked up at him over her notes. "Someone has to." Something that was almost a smile moved across his face. Brief and unguarded, in a way she suspected he hadn't intended. She looked back at her notes before either of them had to decide what to do with it. She started paying closer attention to Seorin on day 4. It was not a decision exactly more, the natural extension of the thing she'd been doing since she arrived, which was reading the estate the way she read a clinical environment. Who moves where, who has access to what, whose behavior is consistent, and whose changes around specific triggers. Seorin was polished. Naomi could recognize craft when she saw it, the management of impression, the specific warmth deployed toward Ji-taek in public that was just calibrated enough to read as genuine without being demonstrative. She was good at it, genuinely skilled. She also touched Ji-taek's water glass on 3 separate occasions in Naomi's sightline, and on the third occasion during a meeting where Ji-taek was distracted, and Naomi was not. She did it with the specificity of intention rather than the casualness of habit. She didn't say anything yet. She watched. She was watching on the evening of day 9 when Seorin found her alone in the hallway outside the medical room and stopped, not blocking, not obviously, but definitely stopping, with a smile that arrived on her face, the practiced speed of someone who decided in advance what this conversation was going to look like. "You've been so dedicated," Seorin said. "He's lucky to have you here." "He's my patient," Naomi said. "That's all." Seorin's eyes moved to Naomi's stomach and back to her face. The smile didn't change. Of course, a pause. You must find all of this overwhelming. A new environment so late in your pregnancy. I want you to know if you need anything. If there's anything that would make your time here more comfortable." She let the sentence end with an openness that was somehow more closed than any specific offer. "I'm fine," Naomi said. "Thank you." She watched Seo Rin move down the corridor with the easy navigation of someone who owns the space she moves through, and she stood there in the hallway with her hand against the wall and felt the cold, specific certainty of something clicking into place. She needed evidence, not instinct evidence. Because going to Ji-taek with instinct about a woman who'd been inside his organization for 7 years was a way to be dismissed, and being dismissed was something she absolutely could not afford right now. She went back to the medical room and pulled up the treatment logs and began cross-referencing the timeline of Ji-taek's symptom spikes against the estate's internal calendar meeting logs, meal times, which events Seo Rin had been present at and which she hadn't. The correlation was not subtle once you knew to look for it. She worked through the night carefully, methodically, with the specific focus of someone who has found the thread and is pulling it toward the light, regardless of what's attached to the other end. By 3 in the morning, she had something, not everything. Not enough to take to Ji-taek with the completeness she'd need to make it irrefutable. But enough to know she was right. She saved everything to a location Lim had set up that was outside the estate's main network, his suggestion, from the first day, after she'd explained what they were dealing with. She sat back in the chair and looked at what she'd assembled. Someone inside this house was killing Ji-taek, and that someone had just had a conversation with Naomi in a corridor that was either a probe or a warning, and either way meant that Seo Rin had noticed Naomi noticing. That changed the timeline. Naomi pressed her palms flat on the desk and took a breath and thought about the fact that she was 8 months pregnant in a guarded estate, holding information that the person responsible for administering a slow poison had just potentially clocked her holding. She thought about the baby. She thought about what she'd told Ji-taek, "I am not going to let someone else decide how this story ends." She closed the laptop. She needed to move faster than she'd planned, and she needed to do it without letting on that the timeline had changed, and she needed to keep Ji-taek alive and progressing through treatment while she assembled the rest of it, because evidence without a living witness was just paper. She was so absorbed in the logistics of it that she almost missed the soft sound in the corridor outside. Almost. She went still. The sound came again, the particular quality of a footstep that is trying not to be heard. Outside her door, at 3 in the morning, in a corridor that should have had nobody in it. She looked at the laptop, at the door, at the window. She made the calculations the way she always made them, fast, practical, without the luxury of being wrong, and she reached for her phone. Then the door opened. It was not Seo Rin. It was one of the younger guards, a man she knew by face and not yet by name, someone she'd placed in the category of Ji-taek's security without thinking further about his specific allegiance. He was standing in the doorway with an expression that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite succeeding. "Mr. Kwon wants to see you," the man said. "At 3 in the morning. Naomi looked at him. "Right now," she said. "Yes." She picked up her phone. She picked up the small secondary drive where she'd backed up everything she'd compiled tonight. She stood up. "Lead the way," she said. She followed him down the corridor and tried to read the shape of what was happening, whether this was Ji-taek unable to sleep and wanting to talk, which was possible, which had happened twice in the past, which had happened twice and entirely, something that meant the window she'd thought she had was already closing. The guard stopped outside Ji-taek's private study. She went in. Ji-taek was standing at the window with his back to her. His right hand was at his side, and it was steady. The treatment was working. But his shoulders had the set of a man who has just received information that he is still deciding what. "Close the door," he said. She did. He turned around. His face was something she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger, something colder than anger. Something that had the quality of a decision already made. "Tell me what you know about Baek Do-yeon," he said. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Naomi felt the floor tilt fractionally beneath her, not literally, but in the way that happens when the situation you understood shifts into a configuration you didn't account for. I don't know who that is, she said. Ji-taek looked at her. Someone with access to my private communications intercepted an encrypted message tonight. The message used a code that is known to only 6 people in this organization. Plus, he stopped. Started again. Plus whoever they might have shared it with. Ji-taek. The message was traced to a device registered in Morro Bay, Oregon. He said it flat-ass precise and without heat, which was somehow worse than if he'd been furious. The timing corresponds to 3 days before I sent people to find you. The silence was complete. Naomi stood very still and understood, with the crystalline clarity of someone who has just seen the shape of the trap close, exactly what was happening. She had been set up, not sloppily, not obviously, with the kind of precision that takes time and access and detailed knowledge of both Ji-taek's communication infrastructure and Naomi's own history and location. Someone had been building this before Naomi ever arrived at this estate. And Ji-taek was standing there looking at her with the expression of a man whose deepest wound, the inability to trust, had just been reopened with surgical accuracy. And she could see the moment where he was deciding whether what he'd started to feel about her was evidence of catastrophic misjudgment. It wasn't me, she said. I want to believe that. I don't need you to want to, she said, and she heard the edge in her own voice, sharp and necessary. I need you to think. 6 weeks ago, someone was close enough to you to begin administering a cumulative poison that your own medical team didn't catch. That same someone has access to your private communications infrastructure. And right now they've handed you something that looks exactly like evidence against the one person in this house who found what they were doing. The room was very still. Ji-taek looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away. The drive in your hand, he said slowly. What's on it? She held it out. He didn't take it immediately. He looked at it, then at her face, then at it again. Then he took it. The silence stretched. Outside the window, Greyhaven was dark and wet, and the estate lights threw long shapes across the garden. And somewhere in the east wing, a woman who had spent 7 years building something in the ruins of other people's trust was waiting to find out whether she'd finally broken the right thing at the right moment. She had almost gotten it right. Almost was going to be the word that undid her. But that reckoning was not tonight. Tonight was the pivot point, the moment where everything that had been moving in one direction gathered itself and began, invisibly, to reverse. And Naomi Everette was standing in the middle of it, with a drive in Ji-taek's hand, and 8 months of a life she'd built inside her, and the absolute, bone-deep certainty that walking into this house had been either the best or worst decision she'd ever made, and she still did not know which. Ji-taek held the drive for a long moment without moving. Naomi watched him. She had learned, over the past 9 days, to read the quality of his stillness. There were different kinds, and this one was the kind that meant he was running something through its full logic before he committed to a direction. Not doubt exactly. More like the particular care of a man who has been wrong before in ways that cost him, and who knows the specific weight of being wrong again. He crossed to the desk. He plugged the drive into his laptop. He read without speaking. She stood near the door and let him read. Her feet hurt. Her back had been making its opinions known since about 10 in the morning. She put one hand against the wall behind her and breathed through it and kept her face neutral, which was getting harder to do the longer she stood in one place. He was on his second pass through the data when he stopped. This correlation, he said, between Seo Rin's access to my meals and the symptom spikes. You built this from the treatment logs and the estate's internal calendar, the meeting records. You sign off on scheduling daily. The timestamps are verifiable. Lim helped you access this? Lim set up the external server. The analysis is mine. He was quiet. He scrolled back through it. She watched the muscle in his jaw work. You did this last night, he said. Between midnight and 3 this morning. Yes. While you're 8 months pregnant. The baby doesn't affect my ability to read a data set, Naomi said. She just makes the chair uncomfortable. Something crossed Ji-taek's face at the word she. Something that was involuntary and brief, and not about the case they were building, absorbed it and moved on with the control of a man who has had extensive practice compartmentalizing the things that get through his armor. He said. I find out next week officially, Naomi said. That's what Lim thinks, based on the last scan. Ji-taek looked at the screen, then back at her, then back at the screen. The Marrow Bay device, he said. The encrypted message. I need to show you something. He opened a separate file on the laptop, not from her drive, from his own system, and turned the screen toward her. She walked to the desk and looked at it. It was a communication record. Encrypted header, timestamp, routing data. She wasn't a cryptographer, but the structure was clear enough that the Marrow Bay origin point stood out like something underlined. When was this message sent? She asked. 4 days before I sent Yoon to locate you. And it was sent to Baek Do-yoon's organization, specifically to a contact we've been tracking for 8 months. He paused. The message contained details about my ambush recovery. Location of the estate's secondary medical facility. Information about the bullet wound. Another pause. And a reference to the fact that I was searching for a woman named Naomi Everette. She stared at the screen. The thing that was assembling itself in her mind was ugly. Not complicated ugly, because it was the kind of setup that only works when the person constructing it knows the target audience with precision. Seo-rin knew Ji-taek's deepest fault lay in the inability to trust, and she had built something that would land directly on it. A device registered in Marrow Bay, a message timed to precede Naomi's arrival. The implication that Naomi had known Ji-taek was looking for her. A sound like greenwood splitting, that she'd been in contact with his and was carrying his chasselt, had been playing both sides from the beginning. It was elegant in the way that certain kinds of cruelty are elegant. Seo-rin knew you were sending people to find me, Naomi said. She has access to my operational planning. She has had it for 7 years, and she used it to build this before I ever walked through your door. Naomi straightened up from the screen. The device registration, can you trace where it was purchased? Who registered it? My people are already on that. Then you need to give them tonight to work. Because if you move on this before the trace comes back, she'll know you've identified her, and whatever evidence chain she's built against me gets deployed faster. I'm aware. I know you're aware. I'm saying it anyway, because the version of you that operates from instinct is going to want to move now, and I need you to hold that for 12 hours. She held his gaze. Can you do that? He looked at her for a moment. You're very direct with me. I'm direct with everyone. You're just not used to it. This time the thing that moved across his face was more definitively something. Not quite a smile more, the shadow a smile would leave on terrain that doesn't get a lot of light. 12 hours, he said. Lim needs to know. His access to the external server. Lim knows everything I know. He's been careful. Good. Ji-taek closed the laptop. Go back to your room. Sleep. I need you, he stopped. Revised. The baby needs you rested. She noted the revision. She let it go. She went back to her room and lay down in the dark and looked at the ceiling and told herself to sleep. Her brain did not comply. It ran the logistics instead, what the next 12 hours needed to look like, what could go wrong, the specific variables she couldn't control, until somewhere around 4:30 her body overrode it, and she went under. She slept for 4 hours. When she woke, something in the estate had changed. It took her 3 minutes to identify it, the particular quality of silence that is not absence of sound but presence of held breath. Staff who normally moved through the corridors with the easy routine of people who know their schedule were scarce. She passed 2 guards on the way to the medical room, and both of them registered her with a fraction more attention than usual, which meant something had shifted in their instructions. She found Lim in the medical room already, reviewing Ji-taek's overnight monitoring data. He's improving, Lim said before she asked. The overnight readings are the best we've had. His body is clearing the toxin faster than projected. Good. She looked at Lim's face. What else? He hesitated. There was a meeting this morning. Early. Ji-taek and Yoon and 3 others I don't have names for. It ran 90 minutes. About what? I don't know. But when it ended, Seo-rin's usual access to the East Wing corridor, the one that passes the kitchen, and the private dining room was quietly restricted. He said it carefully, like he was handing her something fragile. I only know because the guard rotation changed, and I happened to notice. Naomi stood very still. Ji-taek had moved. Not the full 12 hours, she'd asked for maybe 8, which meant the trace on the Marobei device had come back faster than expected, or something else had surfaced that accelerated the timeline. Either way, Seo Rin was now restricted, which meant Seo Rin knew something had changed. Keep the monitoring running, she told Lim. Stay in this room today if you can. Don't go looking for information. She left the medical room and went looking for Ji-taek. She found him in the main corridor with Yoon, both of them moving with the directed speed of men who have a clear destination. She fell into step beside them without asking permission. Walk with me, Ji-taek said, which was close enough to an invitation. The device trace, she said quietly, for him alone. Purchased in Greyhaven, 6 weeks ago, registered under a name that doesn't exist. But the payment method indirect through 2 shell transactions traces back to a holding account that Seo Rin controls for organizational expenses. He said it without affect. She thought the indirection was enough. It should have been enough, Naomi said. For most people, I have better forensic accountants than most people. They reached the end of the corridor. Yoon peeled off toward the east wing. Ji-taek stopped. I'm going to speak with her this morning, he said. I want you somewhere safe while that happens. It's not about whether you can handle yourself. It's about what she might do if she realizes the evidence chain has collapsed. His voice was even, but she heard the thing underneath it. She's been in this organization for 7 years. She knows how we handle betrayal. Cornered people make unpredictable decisions. Naomi looked at him. And you want me out of the way, so I'm not a leverage point. Yes. She hated that he was right. The medical room, she said. I'll be with Lim, but I want to know what she says. You'll know, he said. She went back to Lim and sat in the medical room and tried to review treatment notes and found herself reading the same 3 lines for the 4th time and set the notes down. The estate was quiet in the way that pressure is quiet. She was aware of the baby, moving slow, intermittent rolls, the kind of movement that in a week or two would shift into the more assertive and space-occupying variety. That was the body's way of announcing imminent arrival. She put one hand on her stomach and pressed lightly and thought about Marobei, about the kitchen with the radiator, about Patterson and Dee and the view of the water. She thought about the specific arrogance of what Seo Rin had done, building a frame not just against Naomi as a threat, but against the child. Because that was what it amounted to. Get rid of Naomi, get rid of the baby, get Ji-taek back into a configuration where the person managing his trust is the person administering his poison. The cold of it was extraordinary. She was still sitting with that when the sound reached her. Not a scream, something shorter than that. A single sharp sound from somewhere in the east wing, followed by a silence that had a different quality than the one before it. Lim looked up from his screen. She was already standing. Stay here, she said. She went into the corridor. There were 3 guards moving past her fast, toward the east wing with the focused urgency that told her something had happened, and it hadn't been planned. She followed. The east wing sitting room. Ji-taek was standing near the window, and he was not visibly hurt. That was the first thing she checked, but the room had the aftermath quality of something that had moved quickly. A chair displaced. A glass on the floor, not shattered, just down. Yoon was by the door, with an expression that had been locked. Seo Rin was there. She was composed. That was the first thing Naomi noticed and immediately catalogued. Not the composition of someone who has just been confronted and is maintaining dignity. Something more deliberate than that. Her hands were folded in her lap, her posture was exact, and her face was arranged in an expression of calm that was so perfectly constructed that it was itself a tell. She looked at Naomi when Naomi came through the door, and something moved in her eyes, not shock, not guilt. Something that was closer to recognition. The recognition of someone who had been running a calculation and had just gotten a piece of data that confirmed it. She found you useful, Seo Rin said. Not to Ji-taek. To Naomi. In English. I want to understand how much of it was real and how much of it was performance, because you're very good. Naomi looked at her. Don't, Ji-taek said. I'm not talking to you right now, Seo Rin said, and somehow the familiarity of it The 7 years of proximity that let her speak to him that way made it more devastating than anything hostile. I'm talking to her, because if I'm going to be destroyed by this, I'd like to understand what I was actually dealing with. She tilted her head at Naomi. How long have you been working with Do-Yun? I'm not working with anyone, Naomi said. I'm a nurse. I was on the docks that night by accident. Nothing is by accident in this world. It is in mine, Naomi said. That's the thing you got wrong. I don't come from your world. I came from mine, and I saved a man who needed it, and then he humiliated me, and I left. Everything after that was your construction. Seo-rin studied her for a moment with the complete attention of someone trying to find the seam in a performance. You actually believe that, she said, like it was a finding. I believe it because it's true. If it's true, Seo-rin said, then you are the most dangerous kind of person. The kind that doesn't know they've become a weapon. The room was very still. Ji-taek made a small sound that was not quite a word, and Seo-rin's composure slipped just for a moment, just at the edges, and what Naomi saw underneath it was not evil. Not exactly. It was something older and more specific. The particular fury of someone who has spent 7 years in a supporting role and has decided that fury is the only remaining option. I kept this organization running, Seo-rin said, and now the smoothness had fractured, and what was underneath was hot and ugly and human. Every crisis, every transition, every time the structure threatened to come apart, I held it. For 7 years. And you look at her like she stopped, composed herself. The restoration of control was almost physically visible, like watching something knit itself back together. Like I was never in the room. Ji-taek said her name. Seo-rin. Don't say my name with that voice, she said. Like I'm someone you're managing. She stood up. I know every exit from this estate. I know every account. I know every contingency you've ever built, because I helped you build them. Whatever you think you're going to do here, think carefully. You poisoned me, he said, for 8 weeks, while running my communications, while sitting across from me at dinner. The flatness of his voice was something Naomi felt in her chest. Not cold, it had too much underneath it for cold. You were going to let me deteriorate until it looked like my body failing. And then you were going to manage my succession. Someone was going to manage your succession, Seo-rin said. At least I would have protected what you built, while destroying me to take it. While making a choice I earned the right to make. Her eyes went back to Naomi. And then you showed up with his child, and 7 years became irrelevant, overnight, and you looked at her like she was the first real thing you'd ever. She stopped herself again. This time the silence had a different quality. Something exposed in it. Naomi looked at Seo-rin and saw, underneath the danger and the calculation and the very specific fury, something that was just grief with nowhere to go. It didn't make any of it right. It didn't undo the poison or the frame or the collaboration with Ji-taek's rivals. But it was there, and Naomi was not capable of looking at grief without acknowledging it, even when the person carrying it had just spent 6 weeks trying to destroy her. Ji-taek nodded to Yoon. 2 guards came in. Seo-rin looked at them. Then at Ji-taek. The evidence against her, she said. The Marrow Bay recordings, the financial connection to Do-Yun. We traced it, he said. All of it? All of it. Something in Seo-rin's posture shifted the last adjustment of a structure before it comes down. She looked at Naomi once more. Then she looked at Ji-taek with an expression that was very old and very finished. Then I suppose I should have been faster, she said. They took her out. Ji-taek stood at the window after the door closed. He didn't move for a long time. Naomi stood near the door and let him have the silence, and watched his hands, which were still, and his shoulders, which were carrying something that had no easy name. 7 years, he said finally. Yes, I didn't see it. She was very good, Naomi said, and she understood you well enough to hide it in the places you wouldn't look. That's not a comfort. It wasn't meant to be one. She paused. Are you all right? He turned from the window. His face was composited in a way that she recognized now, not the deliberate control of the dock, not the performance of authority, but the actual effort of a man holding something that is heavier than he anticipated and choosing not to put it down in public. No, he said. She nodded. Then don't pretend to be. They stood in the room for a moment in the particular quiet that comes after something has broken that isn't going to be unbroken. There's still Do-yun, Ji-taek said. Whatever Seo-rin gave him location information, operational details, he has it. I know. That makes this house less safe than it was yesterday. I know that too, he looked at her. You should have left when I gave you the chance. Before Marrow Bay. Before I made my decision, she said. I'm not interested in relitigating it. Something in him settled. Not resolution, more like a load redistributed. He looked at her for a long moment, with the kind of direct attention that she'd noticed from the beginning was one of his actual qualities, as opposed to the ones he performed. The baby, he said. If it's a girl, she held his gaze. What about it? I'd like to. I don't know what I'm allowed to want. I'm aware of that, he said it, with the difficulty of someone who has no practice at this specific mission. I'm aware that I've given you no reason to factor my preferences into anything. Naomi let that sit for a moment. You can want things, she said. Wanting them doesn't obligate me to provide them. But you're allowed to want. He nodded. That was all. Just a nod, but it was real in a way that some of his words hadn't been yet. She was thinking about that when Yoon appeared in the doorway. His face told her before he opened his mouth. We have a problem, Yoon said. He spoke in Korean to Ji-taek for 30 seconds, watching the room in that watchful way he had. Ji-taek's expression went through something fast, several things in sequence, and then locked. What? Naomi said. Ji-taek looked at her. Seo-rin made a call before we contained her, he said. 40 minutes ago. From a secondary device we didn't know she had. To Do-yun, we don't know that yet. But the timing. Yoon said something else, and Ji-taek stopped. What'd he say? Naomi asked. The estate's external perimeter, Ji-taek said slowly. 2 vehicles, unfamiliar plates, positioned in a pattern that looks like a blocking formation. The air in the room changed. Naomi felt it before she fully processed it, the shift from complicated but contained into something more urgent and more physical. Her heartbeat recalibrated. Not panic. She didn't panic. But the body's preparation for a different kind of situation moved through her with a clarity that was almost chemical. She gave him our location, Naomi said. She gave him everything, Ji-taek said. And for the first time since she'd known him, she heard something in his voice that had no performance in it at all. The stripped-down sound of a man who has just watched his own fortress become the trap. The next 4 hours were the fastest and most disorganized Naomi had experienced since the dock. Ji-taek moved the estate onto a lockdown configuration that she could see was well rehearsed, but hadn't anticipated exactly this scenario: internal betrayal plus immediate external threat, simultaneous, with operational intelligence already compromised. His people were good. She could tell that. Buffet and adequately prepared were different things, and the difference was visible in the specific tension of Yoon's communications and the fact that Ji-taek was making decisions faster than was comfortable. She was kept in the interior of the estate, not locked up. Ji-taek was careful about the distinction, but positioned centrally where the layers of personnel were thickest. She didn't argue with this. She was 8 months pregnant, and she knew when her mobility was a liability. She sat with Lim, and they kept the medical equipment running, and she reviewed her own preparation for action, but for whatever medical situation this night might produce. It was the thing she could control. Around 3 in the afternoon, the perimeter vehicles disappeared. Nobody inside the estate treated that as good news. They're reconfiguring, Ji-taek told her, on one of 3 brief visits that day. He was moving constantly, which she could see was costing him. The treatment had made progress, but he wasn't at full capacity yet, and the physical output was working against the recovery. She didn't say this, he knew it. Do-yun's pattern, she said. What does he do when he has location intelligence, but isn't ready to move immediately? Ji-taek looked at her. He waits for a pressure event. Something that forces a response and creates a gap. What kind of pressure event? He didn't answer immediately. She watched him calculate. Information, he said. He releases information, something that creates internal chaos that he can exploit. What information does he have? Everything Seo-rin gave him. Which means everything she knew. He said it flatly. Which means everything. She let that land. Then he doesn't need to wait for a pressure event, she said slowly. He already has one. He's just deciding when to use it. Ji-taek looked at her. She watched him see it at the same moment she did. The fabricated evidence, the Marrow Bay device, the encrypted communication records, the financial traces. Seo-rin had built them for Ji-taek to use inside the estate. But the same materials, the same digital record of Naomi Everette's apparent collaboration with Baek Do-yoon existed outside the estate in whatever form Seo-rin had transmitted to Do-yoon's organization. Which meant Do-yoon had them too, and Do-yoon could deploy them. Not inside the estate, Ji-taek had already traced the frame here. But outside it, in the external networks and alliances that Ji-taek's organization depended on, among the people and factions whose understanding of what the Haryong Syndicate was and who could be trusted at its center was based entirely on what they were told. He's going to use the evidence, Naomi said, not to convince you. You already know the truth. He's going to use it to convince everyone else. The hallway was very quiet. My allied organizations, Ji-taek said. If they receive evidence that the mother of my child is working with Do-yoon, the interpretation isn't ambiguous. It says I've been compromised. It says my judgment is gone. It says the Haryong Syndicate is already penetrated at the center. He stopped. Looked at her. It doesn't matter what the truth is. The story it tells is the one that destroys the organization. This was the specific shape of the trap. Seo-rin, even contained, had already sprung it. Naomi stood in that hallway and felt the full weight of it, not just what it meant for Ji-taek's organization, not just what it meant for his position and his alliances, but what it meant for the two of them and the child that was 8 months real inside her body. Because the frame wasn't just political, it was personal. It was the story that the woman Ji-taek had brought into his estate was his enemy, that his trust had been catastrophically wrong, that everything he'd allowed himself to start to feel across 9 careful days was the exact mistake his enemies had predicted he would make. We have to disprove it, she said, before he releases it. Whatever evidence, we have the trace, the holding account, the real timeline we have to get it out first. To whoever Do-yoon plans to contact, that would mean confirming that Seo-rin was the source, which means confirming she's been contained, which tells Do-yoon that his inside access is severed. Ji-taek's voice was working through it. He moves immediately if he knows that, and if he releases the evidence first, your alliances fracture and he moves into the gap. She pressed her palm against the wall. Either path he moves. Yes. Then you need to choose which ground you fight on. He looked at her directly. In the low light of the corridor, stripped of every managed layer that usually came with him, he looked like what he actually was, a man who had built an empire on the particular willingness to make decisions that other people couldn't make, and who was now standing at the edge of the most expensive one of his life. If I confirm Seo-rin and move preemptively, I might hold the alliances, he said. But Do-yoon attacks tonight. Yes, this estate is not adequately configured for a direct assault. Not with the intelligence already compromised. I know. That means I need to move you before any of this happens. Before the decision point. Naomi stared at him. Move me where? Somewhere Do-yoon doesn't have coordinates for. He said it with the precision of a man who has already in the 30 seconds of this conversation made the calculation he needed to make, and is now executing it. There is a secondary location, not in any of Seo-rin's operational knowledge. Only 3 people in the organization know it exists. You want to move me tonight. Within the hour, she looked at him. She looked at the hallway around them, the guards, the locked-down quality of the estate. The specific atmosphere of a structure preparing for something it can't fully predict. The baby, she said. Lim goes with you, and you? He held her gaze. I stay here, I make the preemptive move. I give Do-yoon the fight he's looking for, on ground he doesn't have mapped. The words were so clean and so deliberate that it took her a moment to hear what was underneath them. He was telling her he was going to fight this here, with a compromised position and partial capacity, and an assault coming within hours. He was telling her she was going to be somewhere else when it happened. That's not she started. It's the only configuration that makes sense, he said. You and the baby secured, me here, the alliance is contacted. The evidence released preemptively. He paused. If I don't survive this, you are the only one who knows the full truth of what Seo-rin built. You have the data. You have Lim. He stopped. She felt something shift inside her chest that she had been careful not to let move. I need you to be somewhere. I don't have to worry about, he said. That's all. That's the only part of this I can't do if I'm calculating for you and the baby at the same time. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. She felt the argument she had ready. She wasn't his to manage. She wasn't a vulnerability to be secured. She had survived in harder conditions than this rise and then settle, because this was not the moment for it, and she knew it. This was the moment where the logic of the situation had reduced the available options to their simplest forms, and the simplest form was this. The baby was the priority. Not her pride. Not the instinct to stay and fight. The baby. 1 hour, she said. 40 minutes, he said. I'm going to start the contact process now. Be ready. He turned. She said his name, Ji-taek. He stopped. Didn't turn immediately, then did. She didn't have words for what she wanted to say. She had an instinct and a feeling and an 8-month reality sitting between her ribcage and her dignity, and none of it reduced to a clean sentence. She looked at him in the corridor of his fortress that was already halfway gone, and she thought about the dock and the notepad, and the 4 words she'd left under his hand. Don't make that sacrifice dramatic, she said. Dramatic is easy. Surviving is harder. Do the harder thing. He looked at her. I'll try, he said. He left. Naomi stood in the corridor and pressed her hand flat against the wall and breathed through the particular weight of knowing that in 40 minutes she was going to get in a car and drive away from something that had not yet resolved into a clear shape, and that by the time it did, she might be somewhere she couldn't affect the outcome. She went to pack. She was halfway through it when her phone showed a notification from the secondary server. Lim had set up an alert she'd configured herself 3 days ago, when she'd first suspected the timeline might compress. A data ping. Something had accessed the external server from inside the estate's network. Not Lim. Lim's credentials had a different signature. Not Ji-taek. He didn't know the server existed. She stared at the notification. Someone else inside this estate had just accessed the file she'd built on Seo-rin. The correlation data, the symptom timeline, all of it. And whoever it was had pulled it with a credential that looked, on the surface, like one of Ji-taek's own senior security identifiers, an identifier she knew, from the access logs, had been used consistently for 3 years without anomaly. An identifier that belonged to Yoon. She sat down on the edge of the bed, with her half-packed bag beside her, and looked at the notification and felt the floor move in the specific way it moves when the thing you thought was the ground turns out to be the layer above the real thing. Yoon had been with Ji-taek for 11 years. Yoon was the person Ji-taek trusted without qualification. Yoon was currently in the operations room, running the contact process to Ji-taek's allied organizations, the preemptive move that was supposed to get ahead of Do Yoon's evidence release. Naomi looked at the notification on her phone. She looked at the door. She thought about Ji-taek telling her he was staying to fight on ground he controlled. With a communications process being managed by a man who had just accessed intelligence, he had no reason to access at 3 in the morning 6 days ago and had not mentioned it. She thought about Seo-rin's last words. At least I would have protected what you built. She thought about the specific shape of a trap as more than one layer. And then she stopped packing and reached for her phone and dialed Ji-taek's number and listened to it ring in the operations room, down the hall, where the man standing next to him was the one person she could warn him about without walking directly into the room and saying it out loud. The phone rang 4 times. On the 5th ring, it was answered. Not by Ji-taek. The voice that came through was calm and familiar and entirely wrong, and it said in Korean accented English that she recognized from 11 days of proximity, Ms. Everette, I think it would be better if you stayed in your room. And Naomi understood, in the full and terrible clarity of a person who has just seen the complete architecture of a trap she walked into with her eyes open, that the evidence against her was not the worst of what Seo-rin had built. The worst of it was still in the room with Ji-taek, 11 years deep and entirely trusted, and she was on the wrong side of a locked estate with 40 minutes until everything collapsed, and no way to reach him that Yoon did not control. Naomi hung up before Yoon could say another word. She sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 4 seconds. She counted them, because the counting was the thing that kept the panic from making decisions she couldn't walk back. 4 seconds. Then she was moving. She didn't finish packing. She grabbed the medical bag, the secondary drive, her phone, the ultrasound photograph from the front pocket where she'd put it. And she did it in under 90 seconds, because her body had done this before, not this exact situation, but the core of it, the need to move and think simultaneously without the luxury of either slowing down. She went to the door and put her hand on the handle and stopped. Yoon had told her to stay in her room, which meant he was watching. He had access to the estate's camera system. Of course he did. He'd been running security for 11 years, and the moment she stepped into that corridor, she was visible. She stood at the door and thought. The camera in the corridor outside her room was mounted at the east end, covering the approach to the interior of the estate. It did not cover the window on the west wall of her room. She knew this, because she'd mapped every camera she could identify in the first 3 days, the way she mapped clinical environments, not out of paranoia, but out of the professional habit of knowing where the blind spots are before you need them. She went to the window, second floor. The drop to the garden below was not good for a woman at 8 months. She assessed it and set it aside as a last option. What she needed was the internal layout, not the exterior. What she needed was a way to reach Ji-taek that didn't route through any system Yoon controlled. Lim. Lim was in the medical room, which was on the ground floor at the interior of the estate. The medical room had its own dedicated landline, hardwired, a separate system from the estate's main communications network. Lim had mentioned it in the first week as a redundancy. Ji-taek had insisted on after a communications failure 3 years ago. A landline that Yoon's access to the digital network did not touch. She opened her phone and called Lim's personal cell. It rang twice. "I need you to listen to me and not ask questions until I'm done," she said when he picked up. Yoon is compromised. He has access to the external server. He just answered Ji-taek's phone. "I don't know how long this has been in place, but it's operational right now, and Ji-taek is in the operations room with him and doesn't know." She paused. "I need you to use the hardwired landline in the medical room to reach Ji-taek directly, not through any extension that routes through the main system. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" A silence that lasted 2 seconds and felt much longer. "Yes," Lim said. Quiet and certain, "I understand." "Don't call me back on this phone. Assume it's monitored. If you reach him, tell him to find a reason to leave the operations room alone and come to you." "Medical reason. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Do it now." She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand and thought about what Yoon had said, "Stay in your room," and what it meant that he'd said it with that specific calm. Not a threat, not a command, a management. The tone of a man who had a situation partially under control and was trying to keep it that way without triggering the parts that weren't. Which meant he wasn't ready to move yet. Which meant there was still a window. She didn't know how wide. She didn't know what his actual objective was. Was he Do Yoon's? Had he been for years? Or was this something more recent, another layer of what Seo Rin had built? She couldn't know without more time, and time was what she didn't have. She moved to the room's interior wall and sat on the floor with her back against it, the blind spot, relative to the window. The position that gave her the most options. If the door opened and she put her hand on her stomach and breathed. The baby was still. "I know," she said quietly. "I know. We're going to be okay. Give me a few minutes." She didn't know who she was reassuring. The next 18 minutes were the longest of her life. She tracked them on her phone, watching the seconds aggregate, and she went through every scenario she could construct with what she had. Lim reaches Ji-taek. Ji-taek extracts himself from the operations room. Lim tells him. Ji-taek has to process it, 11 years of trust being reclassified in real time, and then act on it without tipping Yoon that the reclassification has happened. All of that in a lockdown estate with an external threat positioning outside and a woman on the second floor who Yoon has just told to stay in her room. Or Lim doesn't reach him. The landline fails. Ji-taek's phone remains in Yoon's possession. The operations room continues running the preemptive contact process through a communications pipeline that Yoon controls entirely, and whatever goes out to Ji-taek's allied organizations is whatever Yoon decides to send. which would not be the truth. She was working through the third iteration of that scenario when the door opened. Not slow, not careful, direct. Ji-taek came through it with the particular velocity of a man who has just reconfigured his entire operational reality and is moving on the new information before the shock of it can complicate the necessary actions. His face was locked in the way she recognized, now not cold, not shut down, but contained the way a pressure vessel is contained, everything held inside a structure that is taking the strain. He looked at her on the floor against the wall, and something moved through his expression that wasn't quite relief, but was adjacent to it. "Can you stand?" he said. "I'm pregnant, not injured," she said, and got up. "Lim told me, all of it? Enough." He was already moving toward the window, scanning it, reading the exterior with the fast precision of someone who has been doing threat assessment for long enough that it's gone automatic. Yoon is still in the operations room. He doesn't know I left. I told him I needed water. A brief pause. He believed it because he's been managing me for 11 years, and he knows I sometimes leave in the middle of things without explanation. How long before he notices? 4 minutes. Maybe 5. She grabbed her bag. "Then we have 4 minutes to decide what we're doing." He turned from the window. He looked at her with the complete attention she'd come to understand. Was his version of laying everything down, no performance, no management, just the actual situation and the actual person in front of him. "Yoon has been feeding Do-yoon's organization for at least 14 months, he said. That's what Lim found in the access logs. Not recent. 14 months, the ambush on the docks. She felt it land before he finished the sentence. "Yoon set up the ambush," she said. "He had the route information. He had the timing." Ji-taek's voice was absolutely level, and she could hear what that levelness was costing him. The 3 men who died on those docks. Yoon chose them for that assignment. The room was very quiet. He's been managing Do-yoon's access to this organization from the inside. "For over a year," Ji-taek said. "Seo-rin's frame against you," Yoon helped her build it. Not because he was working with Seo-rin, because both of their objectives happened to align on the same target. He looked at her. "You removing me removes the child," she said. "Removes the heir. Removes the stabilizing element. Removes the reason I've been making different decisions." He said it directly, without looking away. She didn't have time to process what that meant. Later. She said it in a place she'd return to when this was over. "The operations room," she said. "If Yoon sends out false communications to your allies, I need to take that room back." He said it simply, without warning him. The moment he knows I know, he moves. Not to escape, to trigger. He has a signal to Do-yoon. If he sends it, the vehicles out get authorization to breach. How many people in that room can you trust? He thought. 2, possibly 3. The others I can't verify fast enough. Then you go in with those 2, and you do not let him reach any communication device. She was thinking out loud, organizing it. Lim needs to be out of the medical room. If this goes loud, that's where you want him, somewhere interior, no windows. Already told him. And me? He looked at her. The 4 minutes were running out. She could feel it in the way he was calibrating, the slight lean toward the door. "Interior stairwell," he said. "There's a room at the base of its storage. No cameras, no windows, door locks from inside. It's not on any schematic Yoon would have accessed. Take Lim with you, and if it goes wrong in the operations room, then you stay locked in that room until someone I trust gets you out." He paused. "The code for the lock is my mother's birth year. Lim knows it. Something about the specificity of that, his mother's birth year, kept in a storage room, a private number handed to a man he trusted with his life, hit her in a place she hadn't expected." She nodded. "Go," she said. He went. She heard him move down the corridor with the contained speed of someone who has stopped managing himself for anyone's comfort. She listened until the sound was gone. Then she went to find Lim. The interior stairwell was exactly where Ji-taek had described it. She'd identified the door twice in 11 days and classified it as operational storage without looking further. The room behind it was exactly what she'd expected. Equipment, supplies, a single bulb with a pull chain, a door that locked from the inside with a mechanical deadbolt that required no power to hold. She and Lim went in. He pulled the chain. The bulb was enough. Naomi put her bag on a crate and sat on another one and breathed and listened. The state above and around them was quiet, in the way that is loud, if you know how to hear it movement in calibrated bursts. The particular rhythm of people moving with intent, the occasional sound that could be a door or could be something more consequential and didn't resolve clearly through walls and distance. Lim sat across from her. He was pale in the bulb light, and his hands were folded, with the tightness of someone keeping them still by decision rather than calm. His readings this morning, she said, because she needed to think about something clinical. The tremor. Gone, Lim said. Completely, if he stopped. Started again. Physically, he's at about 70% of baseline. Better than yesterday. 70% is enough, she said. It has to be. They sat. The waiting was its own kind of violence. She was tracking her own body the way she tracked patients, heart rate elevated, breathing pattern compensating, the baby quiet in the way that newborns in utero go quiet when adrenaline is running through the maternal system. A kind of shared response that she found both remarkable and terrifying. She put her hand on her stomach and pressed gently. "Stay with me," she said quietly. "Just a little longer." Lim looked at the floor. 12 minutes into the wait, the estate went loud. Not an explosion, nothing that dramatic. The sounds were human, raised voices in the distance, the hard percussion of a door or a table, a single sharp sound that she classified as not a gunshot, but close to the same register. Then running, then silence, then voices again, closer in Korean, in a tone that was urgent without being panicked. She and Lim looked at each other. She didn't move. Ji-taek had said, "Stay until someone he trusted came for them." She was going to follow that instruction because she'd assessed it and it was the right one, regardless of how badly she wanted to open that door. 4 more minutes. The lock turned from the outside. She was on her feet before it opened, bag in hand, Lim behind her, assessing the person coming through before they were fully through it. It was Ji-taek. He was breathing harder than normal, and there was a cut on his left forearm that had bled through his shirt in a way that looked worse than it probably was. But the functional scan she ran on him in the 3 seconds it took him to get through the door said, ambulatory, no major blood loss, no acute distress beyond the immediate situation. "Yoon," she said, contained. He said it flat and final. 2 of his men chose him. There contained 2. A pause. 3 of Do-Yun's vehicles were parked outside. When they didn't get the signal, they held position for 6 minutes and then fell back. Fell back. They weren't ready for a breach without authorization. His voice had the quality of a man who is still processing the full extent of what just happened while simultaneously dealing with the next layer. Without Yoon's signal, the operation doesn't have a trigger. Do-Yun loses his inside access the moment Yoon is out of play. "Temporarily," she said. "Yes, temporarily." He looked at her arm, at her hand on her stomach. "Are you all right?" "Yes." "You're bleeding." "I know." Let Lim look at it. In a minute, he held her gaze. "I need to tell you something first." He stopped. Looked like a man choosing his words with the care of someone who doesn't get to do this over. 14 months. Yoon has been in Do-Yoon's pocket for 14 months. Every decision I've made in that period, every operation, every alliance, every move I thought I made from a position of strength, he had access to all of it. He shaped what I saw, filtered what reached me. His jaw was tight. The ambush. The men who died. All of it because the person I trusted most in this organization decided my organization was worth more under new management. She watched him. "And you brought me here," he said. "Into all of this. Into a house that was already..." He stopped. "You didn't know," she said. "That's not a comfort." "I know," she held his gaze. "I've noticed you say that back to me." Something fractured slightly in the controlled surface of his expression. Just at the edges. Just for a moment. "Come on," she said. "Let Lim see the arm." She led him to a crate, and Lim opened the kit he'd had the foresight to bring and began cleaning the cut while Naomi stood beside Ji-taek and felt the specific exhaustion of the last hour settle into her like something physical. Because it was physical, it was in her back and her feet and the muscles of her abdomen and the small persistent ache that had been building since about an hour into the wait in the storage room. She noted the ache. She set it aside. "Do-Yun still has the fabricated evidence," she said. He can still release it. Yes. Does he still have coordinates for this estate? Everything Yoon gave him in the past 14 months. Ji-taek didn't flinch from it, which means this location is no longer viable. I need to move the operational center. He paused while Lim worked on his arm. There's a secondary site. Actual secondary, not Seo Rin's files. How do you know that one hasn't been fed to him too? Because it doesn't exist in any system Yoon ever accessed, he said. I built it specifically for a scenario where my primary security was compromised. I told no one except... He stopped. I told no one. She looked at him. Smart, she said. Paranoid, he corrected. There's a difference, and it matters. Tonight they look the same, she said. The cut was clean shallow, would need closure, not dangerous. She watched Lim apply pressure and thought about the ache in her abdomen and decided it was stress and exertion and the cumulative physical toll of the past 14 hours and not the thing that had different. Part of her brain was quietly suggesting it might be. She was not going to be in labor right now. That was not a situation she was accepting. The estate moved to a secondary configuration in the next 2 hours. She was part of it, not directed, not protected bubble, but integrated into the process of deciding what came with them and what stayed. Ji-taek made decisions with a speed and clarity that were different from the past 2 weeks, and she understood 2 weeks ago every decision he made had been filtered through Yoon. Now the filter was gone, and what she was seeing was the unmediated version. He was faster, and colder, and more accurate. She found that complicated. They were loading the second vehicle when her phone showed an alert external, public network, the kind she'd set up to track Do Yoon's organizational communications through the same monitoring Lim had quietly established in week 2. She stopped walking. What? Ji-taek said. She showed him the screen. The alert was a flag on an encrypted transmission through a public relay network that Do Yoon's organization used for external communications. The transmission had gone out 14 minutes ago. She didn't have the full content the encryption was above, what they could crack immediately, but the routing tags were visible, and the routing tags told her the destination list. 12 recipients. She recognized 4 of the organizational codes on the list. Ji-taek recognized all 12. His allied network, he said. He released the evidence, she said. The Marrow Bay device. The financial traces. Everything Seo Rin built. The night air was cold, and the vehicles were running, and the estate was in the organized chaos of rapid relocation, and Kwon Ji-taek stood beside her in the middle of it all and looked at the screen with the expression of a man, watching a wall come down that he'd spent years building. His timing is exact, Ji-taek said. Yoon goes dark. He knows the inside access is gone, so he releases the evidence before I can get the counter-narrative out. While I'm reorganizing, while I don't have a stable communications platform, and while your allied organizations receive evidence that the woman you brought into your house is working for your rival, she said. Their response is going to be withdrawal, he said. Conditional at best, total at worst. He was quiet for a moment. The Haryong Syndicate depends on those alliances for 40% of its operational capacity. Without them, Do-yeon doesn't need to breach this estate. He waits. He lets the organization contract. He moves in 6 months when there's nothing left to resist. The logic was clean and terrible. What's your counter? She asked. He looked at her. I need to contact each of those 12 organizations directly, he said. Not through relay, in person or on verified secure line. I need to give them the real evidence, the Seo Rin connection, the Marrow Bay trace, the thallium timeline before Do Yoon's version calcifies. He paused. And I need to be credible while I do it. Which means I can't look like a man whose organization just lost 2 of its most senior people in 48 hours and whose estate is being abandoned in the middle of the night. But that's exactly what's happened. Yes, she thought. The evidence I compiled, she said. The correlation data. The medical records, the server logs, yes, if I present it, she said. Not as your material. Mine independent of the organization. A nurse, no organizational affiliation, no stake in your alliances, presenting medical and forensic evidence about what was done to you and how the frame was built. She paused. It changes the credibility calculus. He looked at her for a long moment. You'd be naming yourself to 12 criminal organizations, he said. I'm already named to them. Dooyeon just sent them my face. This is different. This is standing up and saying, I'm real, I'm here. And this is what actually happened. I know what it is, she said. I'm asking if you think it works. He held her gaze. It works better than anything else I have. Then that's what we do, she said. Get to the secondary site. Establish the secure line. And then I'm going to need a camera, good lighting, and everything we have on that drive. He looked at her for one more moment, the kind of moment that has too much in it for the situation to hold, and then he nodded once and turned back to the vehicle. She got in. The drive to the secondary site was 40 minutes through roads she didn't recognize, the rain starting again around the 20-minute mark, the kind of Washington rain that doesn't announce itself, just arrives and stays. She sat in the back and worked on her phone, organizing the evidence file into a presentation sequence that a criminal organization's leadership could evaluate without technical expertise. Clear, chronological, each piece linked to its source. She was halfway through it when the ache in her abdomen came back. She paused. She counted the interval from the last one. 22 minutes. She put the phone face down on her knee and looked at the rain on the window and thought, no, not right now. We are in the middle of something. 7 minutes later, it came again. She exhaled slowly through her nose. Controlled. She looked at the front of the vehicle, where Ji-taek was in the passenger seat on his phone, managing the first contacts in the communication chain. She looked at her phone, picked it up, kept working. The secondary site was a structure outside Greyhaven's eastern edge that looked like a logistics company from the outside, and was something considerably more functional on the inside. Clean, maintained, not luxurious. It had what she needed, a room with consistent lighting, a secure communications setup, and a medical station that was better stocked than she'd expected. She went to the medical station first. Lim found her there, 3 minutes later, reading her own body with the clinical focus she applied to patients, and he looked at her face and understood immediately. How far apart, he said, 11 minutes now. He set down what he was carrying. I'll tell him. Not yet, she said. Naomi, 30 minutes, she said. Give me 30 minutes to record this statement and get it transmitted. Then you tell him. She looked at Lim directly. First babies are slow. I know my own body. I have 30 minutes. Lim looked at her with the expression of a doctor caught between clinical judgment and the specific immovable quality of Naomi Everette's decisions. 20, he said, 25. 20. And the moment that changes, we stop everything. She nodded. She went to the room with the consistent lighting, and she sat down in front of a camera that one of Ji-taek's remaining peoples set up without asking why she needed it, and she organized the drive on the table in front of her. And she looked at the lens. She thought about the dock. She thought about the notepad. She thought about Marrow Bay and the radiator and the photograph in her bag with her own handwriting on the back. She thought about what it meant to stand up in front of 12 criminal organizations and say, I'm the woman in Do-yeon's evidence, and here is the truth, and I am not afraid of you. She was afraid. She was very afraid. But she'd been afraid on the dock, and afraid in the storage room, and afraid in the corridor when she heard Yoon's voice on Ji-taek's phone, and none of those times had the fear made the decision. She pressed record. My name is Naomi Everette, she said. I'm a registered nurse with 12 years of field and clinical experience. I have no organizational affiliation with the Haryong Syndicate or any other criminal organization. What I am going to show you in the next 12 minutes is medical and forensic evidence that I compiled independently. And I'm going to ask you to look at it before you make a decision based on fabricated materials, sent to you by someone with a direct interest in your making the wrong one. Her voice was level, not performed. The actual voice of a woman who has decided that fear is not disqualifying and has decided to do the thing anyway. She went through it, every piece of evidence, the symptom timeline, the thallium results, the Seorin correlation, the Marrow Bay device trace, the holding account, the server access logs. She walked through it the way she walked through a clinical case specific, sourced without drama, letting the data do what data does when it's real. 14 minutes, not 12. She pressed stop. She looked at the person who had been running the recording setup and said, "Get that to him. He knows the recipients." She stood up from the chair. The contraction hit at that moment, with a force considerably more authoritative than the preceding ones, and she gripped the edge of the table and breathed through it with the controlled exhale she'd read about and practiced and was now executing in an equipment room in a clandestine facility outside Greyhaven, Washington, and thought, of course, this is how this happens. Lim was there before it finished. 23 minutes, she said. Close enough. Sit down, he said. She sat. He was already moving. With clinical efficiency, the man was a good doctor. She'd known that from week one, and in this moment she was grateful for it with the specific intensity that comes from needing someone's competence and having it available. "How long has this been building?" he said. "Since the storage room," she admitted. "The early ones were mild." "Naomi." "I know." She exhaled through another one. "I know. I needed 20 minutes. Ji-taek was in the doorway. She didn't know when he'd appeared. She looked up at him, and he was standing there with his phone in his hand, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen there before. Not the contained version, not the operational version, not even the stripped-down, honest version from the corridor. It was the face of a man who has run out of ways to manage himself against what he's feeling. "The transmission went out," she said. "All 12 recipients." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "Then stop looking at me like that," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. "You're making it harder to concentrate." He crossed the room. He pulled a chair close and sat down in a way that was close enough to be present without being in Lim's way. And he put one hand on the table near hers, not taking her hand, not performing it, just putting it there, and she felt the particular human weight of it. "The evidence is out," he said quietly. "The 12 organizations have what they need to make a real decision." "I know. Duyun doesn't have a usable inside line anymore." "I know that too, and you're having a baby," she said. "Yes, I'm aware." He was quiet for a moment. She breathed through another contraction and felt his hand move fractionally closer on the table. "What do you need?" he said. "For you to not be in crisis right now," she said. "Because I have enough going on." Something moved through his face that was the most unguarded thing she'd seen from him yet. Something that was almost humor and was also, underneath it, more than that. "I'll try," he said. It was the same thing he'd said in the corridor when she told him to do the harder things and survive. She noticed it. She set it aside for later. She had very immediate priorities. The next 3 hours were not fast, and they were not clean, and they were not the version you could retell without the parts that were just hard, the parts where her body was doing what 8 months of preparation had been building toward, and the facility around her was simultaneously processing the aftermath of everything that had happened, and Ji-taek was in the chair beside the table and didn't leave, which she had not asked for and did not tell him to stop. Lim was excellent. The baby arrived at 4:47 in the morning with the specific and absolute authority of someone who had waited long enough. She was small, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, which Lim announced with the satisfaction of a man who has just navigated a genuinely complicated situation to a good outcome. She was healthy. Her lungs made their opinion of the world known at volume. Naomi held her and felt the specific and total reorganization of everything inside her that was not clinical and not strategic and not composed. "Hi," she said very quietly. "Hi. I've been waiting to meet you." She heard Ji-taek's breath change beside her. She looked up at him. A sound scene. He was looking at the baby with the expression of a man encountering something that has no category in his existing understanding of the world, and she could see him trying to find the right framework for it and failing completely, and the failing was the most honest thing she'd ever seen from him. He started. "Yeah," Naomi said. He reached out, stopped, looked at Naomi. "You can," she said. He touched the baby's hand, very carefully, with the particular gentleness that large and powerful hands sometimes carry when the person operating them has decided that gentleness is the thing required. The baby's fingers closed around one of his, with the reflexive grip of a newborn that means nothing and somehow meant everything. Ji-taek sat very still. "Micah," Naomi said. He looked up. "If she'd been a boy, I was going to name her Micah," she said. I need a name." She looked at the baby. "What do you think?" she said. Not to Ji-taek, or not only to Ji-taek, to the room, to the situation, to the strange, terrible, long, specific road that had ended up in this equipment room, in a clandestine facility, with a man who had humiliated her on a dock and poisoned by his own people and betrayed by his longest-serving employee. Sitting beside her while his daughter held his finger. "Clara," Ji-taek said. She looked at him. "My mother's name," he said. "If you don't, Clara," Naomi said. She looked at the baby. "Clara." The baby's grip didn't loosen. Outside, across Greyhaven, Do-Yun's organizational network was receiving 11 minutes of medical and forensic evidence from a woman with no stake in their decisions except the truth, and the 12 recipients were making the calculations that Do-Yun had built his entire strategy on preventing them from making. And in a secondary facility on the eastern edge of the city, the most dangerous thing that had happened to Baek Do-Yun's plan was not Ji-taek's operational response, or Seo Rin's containment, or Yoon's neutralization. It was a 7-pound, 2-ounce girl who had arrived at 4:47 in the morning and had no idea yet what she had already changed. Do-Yun didn't know it yet either. He was about to find out. Clara slept through most of the next 72 hours in the particular way of newborns, who have no concept yet of what they arrived into, which Naomi found both remarkable and something close to merciful. The secondary facility was not a maternity ward. It was not comfortable. The cot Lim arranged for her was adequate, and the supplies were sufficient, and Ji-taek's people moved around them with a careful consideration that told her someone had given specific instructions about noise and proximity that she chose not to interrogate. She focused on Clara, on feeding and sleeping, and the slow recalibration of her body after everything it had done in the past 24 hours, which was considerable and which she was not going to dismiss just because there was still a situation happening around her. She was a nurse. She knew the difference between powering through and damaging yourself permanently. She stayed on the cot. Ji-taek came in twice the first day, both times briefly, both times with the specific quality of a man editing himself heavily and trying not to be visible about it. He looked at Clara each time with the expression she'd seen at 4:47 in the morning, the one without a category, and said very little. The second visit, he sat in the chair for 11 minutes and Clara was awake, and Ji-taek put his finger near her hand and she gripped it again. And he sat there in the chair of a clandestine operations facility, holding his daughter's grip with his index finger. Like that was the only thing happening in the world. Naomi watched him from the cot and didn't say anything. On the second day, Lim told her the situation. 6 of the 12 allied organizations had responded to her transmission. 4 had suspended their withdrawal pending verification of the counter-evidence. 2 had made direct contact with Ji-taek. The remaining 6 had gone quiet, which in this particular world meant they were watching and hadn't committed to either side, which was better than it could have been. Do-Yun's evidence release had landed, but it hadn't landed clean. He needed all 12, Lim said, or enough of them to create a cascade. 6 holding position means his calculation was wrong. What does he do when his calculation is wrong? She asked. Lim was quiet for a moment. He adjusts, he said. He's not a man who accepts a failed plan. He escalates. To what? That's what Ji-taek is working on right now. She nodded. She looked at Clara, who was asleep on her chest with the absolute conviction of someone who has found exactly the right place and intends to stay there. He's not sleeping, she said. No. Tell him I said to sleep. 4 hours minimum. He's still on the back end of the collation, and sleep deprivation at this stage compounds the minor. I know, Lim said. I've told him. Tell him I told you to tell him. Something moved at the corner of Lim's mouth. I'll convey that. Ji-taek sent a message through Lim that night. Not a visit, a written message on a folded piece of paper that Lim delivered with the neutrality of a man delivering a lab result. She unfolded it. Do-Yun is moving to Venice. He's liquidating assets and relocating to a holding position he established 2 years ago through a European front operation. He will be harder to reach once he's there. I need to close this out before he disappears into infrastructure that costs more time and resources than I currently have. I'm leaving in the morning. Clara and you stay here with Lim and 4 people I trust completely. I'll be back. She read it twice. She wrote on the back, be specific about what closing it out means. I'm not raising this baby to get a knock at the door from someone I don't know telling me what happened to you. She gave it back to Lim. He returned 20 minutes later with the paper again. On the back of her note, it means ending it, not him. The infrastructure, the evidence pipeline, the network he's built to replace what Seo-rin fed him. Without that, he's isolated, exposed. He deals or he spends the rest of his life looking at a smaller and smaller world. A pause evident in the handwriting shift. I'll be specific when I know the outcome. Trust me enough to wait for that. She sat with that for a long time. Then she wrote, I trusted you enough to stand in front of 12 criminal organizations 8 hours after delivering your daughter. Don't mistake that for patience. She didn't send it. She looked at Clara sleeping and thought about what trust actually was. Not the feeling, not the wanting to, but the act of it. The decision you make when the information is incomplete and the stakes are real and there is no configuration where you're not taking a risk. She sent it. No response came back that night. In the morning, he was gone. The next 3 weeks were the kind of quiet that has mass. She established a routine for herself and Clara in the secondary facility because routine was what she knew how to build and what she and Clara both needed. Feeding, sleeping. The careful monitoring of a newborn's early indicators that she did with both professional attention and the particular intensity of a mother for whom this baby represented something that had cost more than she was ready to articulate yet. Clara was healthy. Clara was gaining weight at the right pace. Clara had, in Naomi's entirely objective medical opinion, an excellent grip and an extremely loud opinion about hunger. She let herself have those 3 weeks as mostly about Clara. She let herself have the smallness of it, the feeding at 2 in the morning in a room that wasn't hers, the specific weight of a sleeping infant on her chest, the way Clara's face changed in tiny increments day by day, as though the person inside was working out how to be a person. She heard from Ji-taek through Lim in fragments. Venice. A meeting with 3 of the Allied organizations' representatives, conducted in person. The beginning of a documentation process that Naomi understood, from what Lim explained in the careful way he explained things, to be something like a controlled dismantling, not Ji-taek's organization wholesale, but the compromised elements, the corrupted channels, the infrastructure that Yoon and Seo-rin and Do-yoon had built inside and alongside the Haryong Syndicate for 14 months. Closing it out, she received one message directly, not through Lim. It arrived on her phone from an unsaved number and said only Clara. Does she still... She knew what he was asking. She took a photograph of Clara's hand, fingers slightly open, the way they looked when she just released something. She sent it. No response. But the number was saved in her phone after that, and she understood that was its own kind of answer. On the 22nd day, the situation in Venice resolved. Lim told her about it, in the clinical way she'd come to appreciate, without drama, without the parts that didn't matter, with full accounting of what had actually happened. Baek Do-yoon had agreed to a documented settlement with Ji-taek and the allied organizations that had held position. The terms were specific: dismantling of the operational network Do-yoon had built using Haryong intelligence, surrender of the fabricated evidence against Naomi, and a withdrawal from the territories Do-yoon had been encroaching on for the past 14 months. In exchange, Ji-taek agreed to a verified cessation of any organizational action against Do-yoon personally. Not forgiveness, not alliance. The specific cold peace of 2 men who have looked at the full cost of continued war and decided that cost is higher than either of them can currently pay. And Seo-rin? She asked. Lim was quiet for a moment. She cooperated with the documentation process, he said. In exchange for he paused. I don't know the full terms. Ji-taek negotiated that directly. She's alive. Yes. Naomi looked at Clara, who was considering the light from the window, with the focused attention she brought to all new things. Good, she said. Lim looked at her. She was going to die for something that was also just grief, Naomi said. That's not the same as what she did being acceptable. But she's alive and the situation is documented, and Do-yoon can't use anything she gave him anymore. She paused. That's enough. Lim nodded slowly. Ji-taek is coming back, he said. Tonight or tomorrow. She looked at the window. Okay, she said. He came back the next morning. He looked like the 22 days had taken something from him and returned something else in its place, thinner in the face. And there was a newness to the scar on his forearm, where limb's closure had healed. And his eyes were different, in a way she couldn't immediately categorize. Not hard, not the operational version. Something that had been through a fire and came out on the other side not charred, but changed. He came to the room where she was, and stood in the doorway and looked at her, and then at Clara in her arms, and didn't say anything for a moment. You look terrible, she said. I know. Sit down before you fall down. He sat. She handed him Clara with the practical efficiency of a woman who has been handing Clara to people for 3 weeks to establish that Clara can be held by multiple people without catastrophe, and watched him receive the baby with the same extraordinary care, as the first time, the large hands finding a configuration that worked. The specific stiffness of a man who is afraid of doing something wrong, slowly resolving into something more like instinct. Clara looked up at him with the alert dark eyes she'd had since day 2 and made no particular objection. She remembers you, Naomi said. She's 3 weeks old. Newborns recognize the people in the room when they're born, she said. It's not memory exactly, more like registered. She registered you. He looked at Clara for a long time without speaking. Tell me what happened, Naomi said. He did. He told her the way she'd come to understand. He told things when he wasn't managing them in order, without omission, with the occasional stop, where something was still too recent to narrate cleanly. Du Yun, the documentation, the allied organizations. The conversations he'd had with 6 of them that would not have been possible without her transmission. The 2 that had withdrawn entirely and were not coming back. The Haryong Syndicate, she said when he stopped. What's left of it? He looked at her directly. Less than before. How much less? Enough that what it was isn't what it is anymore. He said it without self-pity, which she respected. Yoon's neutralization alone removed the operational infrastructure for 8 of our active lines. Seorin's removal took the communications architecture. Du Yun's withdrawal cost us the eastern territories he'd taken during the past 14 months. What remains is smaller, more honest, possibly. But smaller. Is it survivable as an organization? Yes. As what it was. He looked at Clara. I don't know if I want it to survive as what it was. She heard that. She didn't respond immediately, because it was the kind of sentence that needed room. What do you want? She said finally. He looked at her with the expression that had first appeared in her Marrow Bay kitchen, the one of a man for whom the question itself was unfamiliar territory. Clara to be safe, he said, genuinely safe, not protected by an organization's reach. Actually safe. He paused. I want to know what kind of father I'm capable of being before I decide I'm one. Another pause. And I want you to, he stopped. Finish that sentence, she said. I want you to have a choice, he said, about what this is. About what you want it to be. Not because I've arranged things, not because the situation makes it logical, but because you choose it. He held her gaze. I know I don't have standing to want that. I'm aware of what I said on the dock and what I've put you through since. I'm not asking you to... Stop explaining, she said. He stopped. I don't need the accounting, she said. I've done the accounting. I've been doing it for 9 months. She looked at him. What I need to know is whether you understand why it matters. Not that it matters to me. Why, he thought about it. She watched him think, which was something she'd come to recognize the real thinking, as opposed to the calculation performance. Because you're a person, he said, not a situation. Not a debt. Not a piece of the problem I was solving. He said it quietly and with the difficulty of a man saying something true that costs him something to say. I treated you like a category on the dock, and I've spent 9 months understanding what that actually means, not as an apology, but as a fact about what I was before you refused to let me stay that way. Clara made a small sound. They both looked at her. She'd closed her eyes again. The sound was just the involuntary small noises of a sleeping infant, the body announcing itself. I'm not taking you back, Naomi said. That's not what this is. There's no back to take you to. He nodded. But I'm not leaving either, she said. Because Clara needs both of us to figure out what we're actually capable of being, and running is not something I've ever done just because it was easier. She paused. And because you almost figured something out before everything collapsed. I'd like to see what happens when there isn't a crisis forcing it. He looked at her for a long moment. What do you need from me? He said. Actually, not what I think you need. Time, she said. And honesty. And for you to understand that being Clara's father is not a role you perform, and it's not a debt you pay. It's something you learn to do by doing it badly first, and then better. She paused. And I need you to understand that I will leave if it becomes something other than what it should be. Not as a threat, just as the truth. I understand, he said. She believed him more than she'd believed him the first time he'd said it. Not completely, but more. 6 weeks later, they moved to Cedar Lake, Maine. It was Naomi's choice, and Ji-taek didn't argue with it, which told her something. Cedar Lake was small and coastal, and had no connection to Greyhaven or the Haeryong Syndicate or anything that had happened in the past year. It had a building that had been a clinic once and had the bones to be one again. It had a quality of light in the mornings over the water that she had seen in a photograph and thought, that. Ji-taek put no guards on the perimeter. That was also his choice, and she noticed it. He was in Cedar Lake 3 days out of 7 at first. Then 4. He stayed in a separate house on the far edge of the town's small center, walking distance from the building they were converting into a clinic, which he worked on with a physical engagement that surprised her initially and then didn't. He was not a man who had ever been afraid of hard work. The empire had come from somewhere, and the somewhere was not inherited. He knew how to build things with his hands. He fixed the clinic's plumbing before he fixed anything else, because she mentioned once early in the conversion that the water pressure in the supply room was inadequate for the sterilization equipment. And she arrived the next morning to find him in the crawl space under the building with a wrench and a problem-solving focus that was entirely divorced from the identity of a man who had recently run a criminal syndicate. You could have hired someone, she said, looking at his legs sticking out from under the building. I know how to do this. His voice came back, muffled by the floor. It's faster. She stood there looking at his legs and thought about the doc. About the man who had looked at her and said what he'd said with such deliberate ease, as if she were barely real. She thought about how far that man was from the pair of legs sticking out from under a community clinic's insufficient, because the water pressure was insufficient. She went back inside and let him work. She opened the clinic 3 months after arriving in Cedar Lake. Small 2 exam rooms, a supply room, a waiting area with second-hand chairs that a woman named Ruth, who ran the hardware store, had helped her source, and that Ji-taek had repainted on a Tuesday without being asked. The town was not wealthy. The clinic charged on a sliding scale that in practice meant many patients paid very little and some paid nothing. And Naomi organized the finances with the same methodical attention she applied to everything and found that it was sustainable, if only just. Ji-taek, without announcing it, put a sum of money into an operating account attached to the clinic's nonprofit structure. Enough to cover 2 years of basic operations. He did it through a financial channel that Lim helped establish, clean and documented. Nothing that carried the fingerprints of where his money had come from. She found out 6 weeks after the deposit was made. She went to his house at 9 in the evening and knocked on the door, and when he opened it, she stood on the porch and looked at him. The clinic account, she said. He looked at her steadily. Yes, you should have told me. You would have said no. Yes, she said. I would have. And the clinic would have been operating at the edge for longer than necessary while you figured out funding sources. And Ruth's daughter, who has the untreated ear infection, wouldn't have been seen last week because you'd still be 2 months from opening. She stood on the porch and looked at him. Next time you ask, she said. Whatever I say, you ask. All right, he said. I mean it. I know you mean it. He held her gaze. I'm sorry I didn't ask first. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she went home, but the next morning she left a cup of coffee on his porch on her way past. Because the apology had been real, and she was not interested in performing a grudge she didn't feel. He found it and didn't say anything about it. That was also something they were both learning, what the things they didn't say were worth. Clara grew. She grew with the determination of someone who has decided that the world is primarily an interesting place and should be investigated thoroughly, which meant that by 5 months she had strong opinions about being put down. By 7 months she had figured out the approximate mechanics of locomotion, even if the execution was still in beta. And by 9 months, she was pulling herself upright against any surface that would support her, and looking at the world from this new height, with an expression that combined Ji-taek's assessment quality with something warmer that Naomi chose not to analyze too directly. Ji-taek came to the clinic on the days he was in Cedar Wake, usually in the afternoon. He learned over the months what was helpful and what wasn't, when to stay out of the exam rooms, how to manage the supply inventory without reorganizing it into a system that made sense to him, but not to Naomi, how to be in a space that was hers without making it feel occupied. He drove elderly patients home when the weather was bad, which started as a one-time thing when Mrs. Farrow, who was 81 and had walked 3 miles in the rain, couldn't get her daughter on the phone, and ended as something approaching a standing arrangement because the town noticed that the quiet man at the clinic could be asked things and would simply do them. Cedar Wake did not know who Ji-taek was. He did not tell them. Naomi did not tell them either, and she thought about that sometimes, what it meant that she'd made that choice, that she'd looked at the man arriving in her waiting area to carry boxes and repaint chairs and drive Mrs. Farrow home, and decided that what she knew about where he'd come from was not the same as what she knew about who he was trying to become. She still didn't know if she'd gotten that right. She suspected she wouldn't know for a while yet. Seorin sent a message 9 months after Cedar Wake, through a channel that suggested she had resources remaining and the specific discipline to use them carefully. The message was short. It said, "I heard about the girl. I wanted you to know that I understand now what I was willing to destroy." That's all. Naomi read it twice. She didn't respond. But she didn't delete it either, and she thought about what Seorin had said in the East Wing sitting room. "I want to understand what I was actually dealing with," and thought that maybe the message was the end of that question. The finding of an answer she hadn't liked. She showed it to Ji-taek. He read it, set it down, looked at nothing in particular for a moment. "What do you want to do with it?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I just thought you should know." He nodded. He didn't ask what she thought about it, which was either because he trusted her to have processed it herself, or because he understood that some things didn't need to be jointly decided. Either way, it was the right response. Yoon was in a facility in Greyhaven, under the documentation arrangement. She didn't think about Yoon much. What he had been to Ji-taek 11 years, the version of trust that is so deep it stops being examined, was a loss she'd watched Ji-taek absorb in the slow and private way of someone who has no template for that specific grief, and so has to build one from scratch. She didn't push on it. She left room for it. Once in the late evening on the porch of her house, Ji-taek said, "He asked about you." Through the documentation channel. Asked if you were all right. She thought about that. What did you tell him? That you're better than all right? A pause. That he should have known you were exactly what you said you were. She looked at the water. "That's not for him," she said. "That's for you." Ji-taek was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I know." They sat on the porch for a while after that, not talking, which was something they could do now, occupy the same silence without it having the weight of everything unresolved. The resolution wasn't complete. She didn't think it would be complete for a long time, maybe ever, because the kind of thing they'd come through doesn't have a clean edge where it ends and something uncomplicated begins. But there was a quality to the silence now that the earlier ones hadn't had. Something that was close to ease. One morning, 9 months into Cedar Wake, Ji-taek arrived at the clinic at a time she wasn't expecting him. Claire was in the back in a bouncer seat that the clinic had no medical use for, but which had become a permanent fixture. A permanent fixture, because Claire's afternoon presence had also become a permanent fixture. And Ji-taek went to Clara. First, he always went to Clara first now, which had started as something Naomi observed carefully, and had become something she no longer needed to observe because it was simply true. Then he came to find her. She was in the supply room, doing inventory, which was not glamorous work, and which she did with the same attention she brought to everything, and he stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. "There's something in my coat pocket," he said. "I'd like you to look at it when you have a minute." "I'm in the middle of I know. When you have a minute." He left. She finished the inventory section she was on. Then she went to the waiting area, where he'd left his coat on the chair he usually occupied, and she reached into the pocket. It was a ring, not ostentatious, not the declaration of a man performing wealth. A simple set with a setting that was understated and specific in a way that suggested it had been chosen by someone who had looked at it for a long time before deciding. She stood in the waiting area of her clinic holding it. He came back in from outside where he'd been with Clara in the yard, and he stopped when he saw her standing there. She looked at him. "This is not a transaction," she said. "No," he said. "It's not because of Clara. No. And it's not because you owe me something." "I know," he said. "I know it isn't." He stopped. He looked like a man who has prepared nothing and is now required to find the honest version without the preparation. "It's because I want to be in the room," he said. "Whatever room you're in. For as long as you'll have me in it. Not because of what I owe you, or what Clara needs, or what makes sense strategically. Because of you," he paused. "That's all it is." She looked at him. She thought about the dock. She thought about 4 words on a folded piece of paper. She thought about Marrow Bay and the radiator and driving south in the dark, with the decision she'd made that she'd been living inside ever since. She thought about a storage room with a pull-chain bulb, and a man sitting in a chair with his daughter's grip around his finger like it was something worth holding on to. She thought about what she'd told him in the beginning. Saving someone's life doesn't make that life yours. She knew now what the full version of that was. Saving someone's life gives that person the responsibility to decide what kind of human being they will become. And then they have to actually do it, not in a grand moment. Not in a Venice canal at midnight with fire and sacrifice and the performance of transformation. In the daily accumulation of ordinary choices driving misses. Pharaoh home, fixing the plumbing before anything else. Going to Clara first. Learning how to be in a room that belongs to someone else without filling it with yourself. That was the version of changed. That meant something. She looked at the ring in her hand. Then she looked at Ji-taek. "Ask me properly," she said. Something moved through his face, not quite a smile, the thing that lived in the same territory as one. He crossed the waiting area and crouched down in the graceful way of a man whose body knows itself, and took the ring from her hand and looked up at her, the expression she'd first seen at 4:47 in the morning, in an operations facility that smelled like equipment and rain. The one without a category. "Naomi," he said, "will you let me stay in the room?" She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, Clara made a sound in the yard, the bright declarative sound she'd developed recently that announced she'd found something interesting, which could be anything from a beetle to a pebble, to the particular quality of afternoon light on a surface, and which she shared with the world at volume, because she had not yet learned that not everything needed to be announced. She'd learn, eventually, or she wouldn't. Either way, it was hers. "Yes," Naomi said. He put the ring on her finger. He stayed on one knee for a moment longer than necessary, and she thought he might be collecting himself, which was its own kind of information. And then he stood up, and she looked at the ring on her hand, and then at his face. "Don't make it dramatic," she said. "I know," he said. He did know. That was, she thought, maybe the thing that mattered most. Outside, the Maine morning was doing what Maine mornings do in autumn, the light coming off the water with that specific golden quality that doesn't exist anywhere else she'd been. The kind of light that doesn't beautify things so much as reveal them, strip away the performing layers and show you what something actually looks like when it's just itself. The clinic sign that Ji-taek had repainted on a Thursday because the old paint was peeling. The yard where Clara was learning that the world has beetles and pebbles and light, and all of it is worth investigating. The town that didn't know who they were and had taken them in anyway, because small places on the edge of cold water tend to evaluate new arrivals on what they actually do rather than what they came from. Naomi stood in the waiting area of her clinic with a ring on her finger and looked out the window at all of it. She had not been rescued by a powerful man. She had not been transformed by love into something she wasn't. She was exactly what she always was, stubborn and skilled, and not interested in being categorized, and entirely capable of keeping a person alive in conditions that should make that impossible, and entirely capable of walking away when walking away was the thing that the situation required. She had saved herself more than once. In Marrow Bay and in the storage room and in the equipment room, with a camera and a drive, and 11 minutes of clinical evidence, and a 3-week-old daughter, and the specific decision to stand up and be seen, because the truth was worth saying, even when saying it was expensive. And after all of that, she had made a different kind of decision, the one that isn't dramatic, the one that doesn't have fire or sacrifice, or a moment that tells a clean story. The one that is just, I am choosing to be in this room with this person, while he learns how to be worth choosing. That was its own kind of strength, the strongest kind, maybe. Not the kind that anyone sees clearly from the outside. The kind that is just present every day in the accumulation of small and ordinary things that add up, over time, to a life. Ji-taek went outside to Clara. She heard him say something to Clara in Korean, which he'd started doing in the past few months. And Clara responded with the sound she made that was not yet a word, but carried the conviction of one. And Ji-taek's voice came back with the lower, softer register he only had with her, the register that Naomi thought was probably the most honest thing about him, the version of himself that the empire and the title and the years of necessary armor had not managed to reach. She went to the window. He was crouching in the yard. Clara, standing against his knees with the determined, upright grip of someone who has figured out verticality and intends to keep it. And Ji-taek was pointing at something in the grass, a beetle, probably, or a pebble, and Clara was looking at it with the focused intensity that was entirely hers. Naomi stood at the window and looked at them. She thought, this is what it costs. All of it, the dock, the rain, the 4 words on a folded paper, the months alone, the estate, the storage room, the 4:47 in the morning. This is what it costs, and this is what it builds. And the price was exactly high enough to make the thing built worth standing in. She pressed her palm flat against the glass. Clara looked up from the beetle and found Naomi at the window and made the sound. The bright declarative sound. The one that, I found something. Look at this. Naomi raised her hand. Clara's grip on Ji-taek's knee tightened as she tried to point, which was still a developing skill, and Ji-taek steadied her automatically with one hand and looked up at the window and found Naomi there, and something passed across his face that she had finally found a category for. It was just home, not the estate, not the dynasty, not the empire or the power or the particular kind of security that comes from having things. Just this, the window and the yard and the morning light and the 3 of them, which was the whole of it, and was, she had decided, enough. She turned from the window and went back to the supply room. The inventory wasn't going to finish itself, and the clinic opened in an hour.